Welcome to the second volume of Horror Stories to Sleep With. Today we've got a great selection of stories for you, so don't forget to subscribe before falling asleep. It was supposed to be a shortcut. Jake had driven this stretch of backwoods road countless times, but tonight the GPS suggested something new. A detour, a thin, winding path that didn't even seem paved. Snow blanketed the area, muting every sound and reflecting the pale glow of his headlights. He hesitated before turning onto the road, but the thought of cutting 20 minutes off his trip was too tempting. The forest closed in immediately. Trees loomed on either side, their branches stretching like skeletal hands toward the road. The snow was heavier here, falling in thick, lazy flakes that made it hard to see beyond a few feet. Jake turned the radio up, trying to fill the oppressive silence, but the static only grated on his nerves. He turned it off. That's when he first heard it. A voice, faint but distinct, calling his name. Jake! He slammed on the brakes, his truck skidding slightly. The road was empty, nothing but endless white stretching ahead and behind him. He rolled down the window, the frigid air biting his skin. "Hello?" he called, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. No response. He rolled the window back up, his heart pounding. He told himself it was the wind or maybe a trick of his tired mind. He pressed the gas and continued forward, the tires crunching over snow. The voice came again, louder this time. Jake? It wasn't possible. It sounded like his sister, Laura. She had died 2 years ago in a car crash not far from here. The thought made his stomach churn. He gripped the wheel tighter, trying to focus on the road, but the voice grew insistent. "Jake, help me." His hands shook. He glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the dark forest. Instead, he saw her, Laura. She was sitting in the back seat, her head tilted unnaturally, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her face was pale, lips cracked and tinged blue. She looked just as she had in the casket, but now she was moving, leaning closer. "Jake," she whispered, her voice brittle and cold. "You left me," he screamed, swerving the truck violently. The tires lost grip, and the vehicle slid off the road, crashing into a snowbank. The airbag deployed with a deafening pop, stunning him. For a moment, all was silent again. When he came to, his head throbbed. The truck was dead, the headlights dimming. He fumbled for his phone, but there was no signal. The world outside was a wall of white. Then he saw the footprints. They led away from the truck, deeper into the woods. Small, bare footprints, like those of a child. They couldn't have been there before. The snowfall should have covered them. A chill ran down his spine, but something pulled at him, urging him to follow. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was desperation. He stumbled out of the truck, clutching his coat tightly around him, and began to follow the trail. The footprints wound through the trees, twisting and doubling back as if trying to confuse him. The forest grew darker, the snow almost blinding. The voice came again, closer now, clearer. "Jake, over here!" He broke into a run, branches slapping his face, the cold seeping into his boots. The trail ended abruptly at a clearing. In the center stood a well, its stones ancient and slick with ice. Laura was there, perched on the edge, her head still tilted unnaturally. "You can save me," she said, her voice hollow. "But you have to come closer." Jake hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to run. But the guilt was overwhelming, suffocating. He stepped forward. As he reached the well, Laura's face twisted, her eyes turning black as her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "You should have stayed on the road," she hissed. Something cold and wet grabbed his ankle, yanking him forward. He screamed, clawing at the icy ground as unseen hands dragged him into the well's abyss. The forest grew silent once more. The truck sat abandoned, snow piling over it, erasing any trace that Jake had ever been there. The road was called La Recta del Silencio, a long, desolate stretch of highway in the heart of the Sonoran Desert. It was infamous among truckers and late-night travelers for its eerie reputation. Stories of phantom hitchhikers, spectral headlights, and unnatural silence haunted the asphalt. Daniel, a seasoned truck driver, dismissed such tales as nonsense. He had a load to deliver and wasn't about to let superstitions slow him down. The first 50 kilometers were uneventful. The moon hung high, casting a pale light over the barren landscape. His truck hummed steadily, a comforting sound in the otherwise silent desert. But then, the radio static started. Daniel frowned, adjusting the dial. A faint voice broke through, garbled and fragmented. "Can't escape. Stay." He turned the radio off, muttering about bad signals, but the static persisted, faint and insidious, as if coming from the truck itself. That's when he noticed the shadow in his rearview mirror. It wasn't a vehicle, no headlights, no sound of an engine, just a dark, human-shaped figure standing in the middle of the road. He slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. When he looked back, it was gone. Shaking it off as a trick of the light, he pressed on. The road ahead seemed endless, the desert stretching infinitely in every direction. The clock on his dashboard blinked 2:33 a.m. and then froze. The temperature dropped. His breath fogged up the cab as a low hum filled the air. The hum turned into a whisper, and then a chorus of voices. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand, their tone urgent and accusatory. The headlights began to flicker. Panic set in as the truck's engine sputtered. He pulled over, cursing under his breath, and grabbed a flashlight from the glove box. The moment he stepped outside, the world went silent. No wind, no distant coyote calls, not even the sound of his own footsteps on the gravel. Just the oppressive quiet that pressed against his ears. He circled the truck, shining the beam of his flashlight on the tires, the engine, the cargo. Everything seemed fine. But when he turned back toward the cab, someone, or something, was sitting in the driver's seat. The figure was slumped over, wearing clothes identical to his own. Its head turned slowly to face him, revealing a face that was his, but distorted. The eyes were hollow, the mouth stretched unnaturally wide. Daniel stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. When he hit the ground, the truck's headlights illuminated the shadowy figure crawling out of the cab. It moved with jerky, inhuman motions, its limbs bending at impossible angles. "Leave, now!" It hissed in a voice that echoed like a dozen people speaking at once. Daniel scrambled to his feet and bolted down the road, leaving the truck behind. The air grew thicker, the whispers louder, like 1,000 voices closing in. He ran until his lungs burned, until the road blurred into the horizon. When he finally stopped, the truck was in front of him. Impossible. The shadow figure stood beside it, pointing at the cargo bay. The whispers turned into screams, a cacophony of pain and anger. Terrified, Daniel opened the cargo doors. Inside was darkness, impenetrable and infinite. He felt it pulling at him, a force stronger than gravity, colder than death. "Finish it," the figure commanded. With no choice left, Daniel stepped inside. The doors slammed shut behind him, and the desert was silent once more. By sunrise, the truck was gone, leaving nothing but tire tracks that vanished into the sand. The highway, known locally as La Senda Negra, cut through the dense forests of the Sierra Madre like a scar. It was a road few dared to traverse at night. Legends spoke of apparitions, inexplicable disappearances, and whispers that followed travelers like the wind. Luis, driving home after a long shift, brushed these stories aside. It was just another road. His old sedan rattled as it climbed the steep, curving path. The forest seemed alive, the trees stretching their gnarled branches toward the sky, shadows twisting unnaturally under the pale light of the moon. Luis felt uneasy, but he couldn't place why. Then he saw her, a woman standing by the side of the road, her back to him. She wore a long, tattered dress, her hair falling in wild strands over her shoulders. Luis slowed, his instincts warring with his sense of reason. She didn't move, no hitchhiker, no wave. She just stood there, motionless. As he passed, he dared a glance through the rearview mirror. She was staring at him now, her face pale and featureless, her hollow eyes locking onto his. Luis's foot hit the gas. The car sped through the curves, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. He didn't look back. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming to get off the road. But the forest stretched endlessly, the highway a tunnel with no end. The radio crackled and a faint voice whispered through the static. "You shouldn't have seen her." His knuckles whitened. "Who's there?" he shouted, but the voice only repeated, growing louder, more insistent. "You shouldn't have seen her." Suddenly the headlights illuminated something in the middle of the road, a black mass, writhing and shifting like liquid shadow. Luis slammed the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The car skidded to a halt mere inches from the shape. The shadow began to rise, forming a vaguely human figure with elongated limbs and a head that twisted unnaturally. Its face was a void, a gaping absence that seemed to devour the light. "Leave," it intoned, the sound vibrating through Luis's chest. Panic consumed him. He threw the car into reverse, but the engine sputtered and died. The shadow advanced, its limbs stretching toward the car, dragging itself forward with grotesque jerking motions. Luis flung open the door and ran. The forest was a labyrinth of darkness, the trees closing in, their roots threatening to trip him with every step. Behind him the whispers began, soft at first, then rising to a deafening chorus. "You shouldn't have seen her. You shouldn't have seen her." The voices surrounded him, coming from nowhere and everywhere. Shadows darted between the trees, figures just out of sight. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning as he pushed forward deeper into the forest. Ahead, a light pierced the darkness, a faint flickering glow. Desperate, he ran toward it, bursting into a clearing. A lone gas station stood there, its neon sign buzzing faintly. The building was decrepit, the windows cracked, and the air reeked of gasoline and mildew. Luis stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind him. The attendant, an older man with a face as weathered as the building, looked up from his counter. "You saw her, didn't you?" the man said, his voice flat. Luis nodded, unable to speak. The man sighed, reaching under the counter to produce a single candle and a box of matches. "It's too late now. She's marked you." Luis's breath hitched. "What does that mean?" The attendant didn't answer. Instead, he lit the candle and placed it in Luis's hands. "Whatever you do, don't let the flame go out. It's the only thing keeping her at bay." Luis turned to look out the window. The shadow was there, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching, waiting. The flame flickered. "Pray it holds," the attendant said grimly, before locking the door and retreating into the shadows of the station. Luis stood there clutching the candle, the shadow drawing closer with every faltering step. The whispers began anew, louder, more insidious. "You shouldn't have seen her." Welcome to the new era of video creation with HeyGen. Simply type your script to get started. The voices surrounded him, coming from nowhere and everywhere. Shadows darted between the trees, figures just out of sight. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning as he pushed forward, deeper into the forest. Ahead, a light pierced the darkness, a faint, flickering glow. Desperate, he ran toward it, bursting into a clearing. A lone gas station stood there, its neon sign buzzing faintly. The building was decrepit, the windows cracked and the air reeked of gasoline and mildew. Luis stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind him. The attendant, an older man with a face as weathered as the building, looked up from his counter. "You saw her, didn't you?" the man said, his voice flat. Luis nodded, unable to speak. The man sighed, reaching under the counter to produce a single candle and a box of matches. "It's too late now. She's marked you." Luis's breath hitched. "What does that mean?" The attendant didn't answer. Instead, he lit the candle and placed it in Luis's hands. "Whatever you do, don't let the flame go out. It's the only thing keeping her at bay." Luis turned to look out the window. The shadow was there, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching, waiting. The flame flickered. "Pray it holds," the attendant said grimly, before locking the door and retreating into the shadows of the station. Luis stood there, clutching the candle, the shadow drawing closer with every faltering step. The whispers began anew, louder, more insidious. You shouldn't have seen her. In a quiet mountain village, nestled beneath a canopy of ancient pines, there was a melody the locals feared. It wasn't sung during festivals or hummed by children. It was whispered about in hushed tones, called simply La Canción Hueca. Miguel was an outsider, a traveling journalist seeking tales of the supernatural. He arrived with a notebook and a skeptical smirk, brushing off warnings from the villagers about the song that came with the wind. "Stay indoors at dusk," an old woman cautioned, gripping his arm. Her eyes darted toward the tree line. "If you hear it, do not follow." Miguel dismissed her words, calling them superstition. That night, he stayed at the only inn in the village, a creaky structure filled with the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. He sat by the window, his pen scratching across paper as he jotted notes. Outside, the forest swayed under a silver moon. And then he heard it. A melody, soft and mournful, floated through the air. It wasn't coming from the village. It came from deeper in the woods. The notes wove together like a siren's call, haunting yet impossibly beautiful. Miguel froze, his pen falling silent. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his flashlight and jacket, drawn by a pull he couldn't explain. The innkeeper called after him, but Miguel was already stepping into the cold night. The forest was alive with shadows, the trees towering like sentinels. The song grew louder, guiding him deeper. His flashlight flickered, casting fleeting glimpses of gnarled roots and claw-like branches. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the melody. The song didn't answer, but it seemed to shift, circling him, luring him forward. He reached a clearing where the trees stood unnaturally still. At its center was a figure, a woman draped in tattered robes, her back turned. Her long hair shimmered, catching the moonlight like strands of silver. "Are you okay?" Miguel asked, his voice trembling. The woman turned slowly, revealing a face that wasn't human. Her features were hollow, her eyes two endless voids, her mouth stretched into a black, gaping chasm. The melody poured from her, not sung but exhaled like a living thing. Miguel stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from his grasp. The beam caught the edge of the clearing, illuminating more figures. They stood among the trees, pale and emaciated, their eyes as empty as the woman's. They swayed to the melody, their movements jerky, unnatural. The song grew louder, piercing Miguel's ears, invading his thoughts. He clutched his head, falling to his knees as visions flooded his mind. Faces screaming in the dark, hands clawing at dirt, endless rows of the hollow-eyed figures marching through shadow. "Stop," he begged, but the melody didn't relent. The woman stepped closer, her hollow eyes locking onto his. Miguel felt his breath hitch as the air seemed to thicken, the song pressing against his chest like a crushing weight. "You followed," she said, her voice layered with countless others, each speaking in perfect harmony. "Now you belong." The figures moved closer, their limbs twitching as they reached for him. Miguel tried to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The melody held him, binding him in place as cold hands gripped his arms, his legs, his face. The last thing he saw was the woman's hollow gaze, her mouth opening wider, swallowing the song as it consumed him. When the villagers found Miguel's belongings near the edge of the forest the next morning, there was no sign of him, only his notebook, left open to a page filled with frantic, illegible scrawls. The melody carried on the wind that night, softer but no less haunting, and the villagers stayed indoors, whispering prayers against the dark. It was supposed to be a shortcut, a secluded dirt road winding through the thick expanse of blackthorn forest. Marta had taken it dozens of times to avoid the longer highway route. It always felt quiet, abandoned. Tonight, it felt different. The headlights of her aging sedan barely pierced the dense fog that clung to the road. The towering trees pressed close, their gnarled branches reaching over the narrow path like skeletal hands. Her radio had given out 20 minutes ago, leaving her with only the hum of the engine and the faint crunch of gravel under her tires. As she rounded a bend, Her headlights illuminated a figure in the middle of the road. Marta slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding. The figure didn't move. It was a young boy, no older than 8, wearing overalls and a tattered shirt. His face was pale, his eyes unnervingly wide. Marta rolled down her window cautiously. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The boy didn't answer. Slowly he raised his arm and pointed into the forest. A deep sense of unease settled in her chest. "Is someone out there?" The boy nodded, his gaze fixed on the trees. Marta hesitated. She didn't want to leave the car, but the boy looked so fragile, so vulnerable. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her flashlight and stepped out. "Stay here," she said, though the boy didn't react. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No wind, no chirping insects, just an oppressive stillness. Marta shone her flashlight into the trees, the beam barely illuminating the twisted underbrush. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. A sound broke the silence, a faint rustling, followed by a low, guttural growl. She froze. The sound came again, closer this time. Turning back toward the car, she gasped. The boy was gone. The growling intensified, now accompanied by the sound of snapping twigs and something heavy moving through the trees. Marta broke into a sprint, her flashlight bobbing wildly. Reaching the car, she threw herself into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Her hands fumbled to start the engine, but it sputtered and died. Come on," she whispered, turning the key again. A shadow moved across the rearview mirror. Her breath hitched. The boy's face appeared at the driver's side window, but it wasn't his face anymore. His eyes were black voids, his mouth unnaturally wide, rows of jagged teeth glinting in the faint light. "You shouldn't have stopped," he hissed, his voice guttural and layered, as if multiple voices spoke at once. Marta screamed as the windows shattered, the darkness of the forest pouring into the car like a living thing. The next morning, her car was found abandoned on the dirt road. The doors hung open, the interior covered in deep claw marks. No trace of Marta was ever found, only her flashlight lying in the middle of the road, its beam pointing toward the forest.
The town of Willow Creek had always been a quiet place, nestled in a forgotten corner of the world, far from the chaos of city life. Few people passed through, and even fewer stayed. It wasn't much to look at. A handful of old brick buildings, faded storefronts, and winding streets that seemed to lead nowhere in particular. But something about it had a pull, a quiet, subtle tug on the soul that made those who came through feel uneasy, as if they didn't belong. One night, in the early hours when the town was hidden in the embrace of darkness, a car appeared on the road that led out of the valley. It was an old sedan, its headlights cutting through the thick fog that rolled over the asphalt. The tires crunched over the gravel as the car slowly made its way toward the center of town. The driver, a man named Jack, having no idea where he was. Jack had been driving for hours, or perhaps days. Time had started to blur into something indiscernible. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but the road kept pulling him forward. It was as if something was guiding him, forcing him to continue even though every fiber of his being screamed for him to stop. His hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white, but his mind kept slipping, like a fog that refused to lift. The town was eerily silent as Jack entered. Not a single light was on in the buildings. No dogs barking, no rustling of trees in the breeze. Just the steady hum of his engine and the soft swish of the wipers pushing the fog away. He passed an old, weathered gas station on the outskirts, the flickering neon sign casting a faint, sickly glow over the deserted lot. The sign was broken, half of the letters missing, but it still seemed to beckon him to stop. But Jack couldn't bring himself to do it. He needed to get out, needed to keep driving, but something had changed. The road ahead felt different now, as if it had become something else entirely. Something that didn't lead anywhere at all. The fog thickened, rolling over the car like a blanket. The world outside the windows became a blur, indistinguishable from the darkness itself. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the car's headlights flickered and went out. Jack slammed on the brakes, heart pounding, but the car continued to coast forward, gliding silently through the night. He cursed under his breath, trying to restart the engine, but the car refused to respond. A sharp sound echoed from somewhere in the distance. A crack, sharp and unnatural, breaking the silence. Jack's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but all he saw was a wall of fog. No other cars, no figures moving in the distance. Just the swirling, oppressive mist that seemed to swallow everything. He reached for the door handle, but before he could open it, something caught his eye. A figure, standing in the middle of the road. Its shape was indistinct, shifting in and out of the fog, as if it were both there and not. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that stretched and twisted like branches of an ancient tree. Jack froze, his breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, simply stood there, staring back at him with hollow eyes. He tried to start the car again, but the engine sputtered, and then nothing. The figure seemed to shift, as though it was aware of his panic. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, and then another, its long, impossibly thin arms hanging by its sides like ropes. Jack's heart raced in his chest. Sweat clung to his palms as he fumbled with the door handle, desperate to escape. But before he could react, a low, guttural voice filled the air. A whisper that sounded like it came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You shouldn't have come here." Jack's blood ran cold. The words seemed to echo in his head, reverberating through the fog and the stillness of the town. Without thinking, he threw open the door and bolted from the car, the cold air biting at his skin. His feet pounded the pavement as he ran, the sound of his footsteps drowned by the oppressive silence around him. He didn't dare look back. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance between himself and whatever that thing was. But the town, it was different. The buildings were gone now, replaced by walls of black, featureless stone that stretched up into the sky, blocking any escape. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The whisper followed him, growing louder, closer. "You shouldn't have come here." Jack's mind raced. He needed to escape, needed to wake up from this nightmare. But it was as if the town itself had swallowed him whole. And then, he heard it. A low, scraping sound coming from behind him. Something dragging along the ground. He dared a glance over his shoulder. The figure was closer now, its limbs moving in unnatural, jerking motions, like a puppet on strings. It was almost within reach. Jack could hear the whispers growing louder, hear the breath of the thing that stalked him, feel its presence creeping closer. His legs burned with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. And then, just when he thought he couldn't run any longer, the ground beneath his feet gave way. His foot slipped, and he tumbled into the darkness below, landing hard on something cold and unyielding. The air around him was thick with a suffocating, damp smell. He gasped for breath, struggling to stand, but the ground seemed to shift beneath him. It was like he was no longer on solid ground, as if the world itself had tilted sideways. Jack's eyes strained to adjust to the dim light, but the darkness was endless. The walls around him seemed to pulse with a strange energy, like they were alive, watching him. And then, in the distance, he heard something else. A soft, melodic sound, like the ringing of a bell, followed by a whisper that chilled him to his core. "Welcome to the town of the lost." Jack froze. The whisper echoed in his ears, a faint, haunting melody. Somewhere, far off in the distance, something stirred, and in the stillness of the void, Jack understood the truth. He was never leaving. Jack's heart raced as the sound of the bell grew louder, closer. His feet shuffled over the uneven ground, the sensation beneath him growing more and more unnatural. Every step he took felt like walking on something that wasn't solid, like the earth itself had become soft and unstable, shifting beneath his weight. The whispering, too, had grown more intense, no longer just a distant sound. It surrounded him, coming from all directions. Each voice was indistinguishable from the other, speaking in a language he couldn't understand, but he felt its weight in his chest, pressing down on him. "Welcome to the town of the lost," the voice repeated, now clearer, as if someone or something had been waiting for him to hear it. The tone was neither welcoming nor threatening, but something in the cadence made his stomach churn. The darkness around him was suffocating, and his breath came in ragged gasps. As he stumbled forward, he noticed a faint glow flickering in the distance, like a candle's flame struggling against the oppressive blackness. It was his only point of reference. Desperate for any sign of life, or even hope, Jack forced himself to move toward it. The air grew colder as he approached the glow, and the whispers intensified, now almost overlapping each other in a cacophony of murmurs. Every step felt heavier than the last. The closer he got, the more the voices seemed to press in on him, as though the very air was alive with them. When Jack finally reached the source of the light, he found himself standing at the edge of a long corridor, walls stretching upwards into infinity. The glow came from small, flickering lanterns placed at even intervals along the passage. But the deeper he looked, the more it became clear that these weren't mere lanterns. The light was coming from eyes, hundreds of them, thousands, eyes that blinked, stared, and turned to follow his movements. Jack's breath hitched, and he instinctively took a step back. His mind screamed at him to turn around and run, but his body wouldn't obey. The eyes were not just watching him, they were waiting, and in some way Jack knew they had always been here, watching the lost souls who passed through this place. A figure emerged from the darkness ahead. At first, Jack thought it was just another illusion, a trick of the mind. But as it drew closer, he could see the figure more clearly. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, elongated limbs that twisted unnaturally. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face was featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, blank surface. The figure stood in front of him now, towering above him, and Jack could feel a coldness radiating from it. The whispers ceased abruptly, as if they were waiting for something. Jack opened his mouth to scream, to ask what this place was, to beg for answers, but no sound came. It was as if the air itself had stolen his voice. The figure reached out, its long fingers extending toward him, moving with an eerie fluidity. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but his legs refused to move. He couldn't escape. He couldn't breathe. The fingers brushed lightly against his face, cold and clammy. And in that moment, Jack felt an overwhelming wave of despair crash over him. It wasn't physical pain. It was something deeper, something that reached into his soul. His entire existence felt insignificant, as if he had always belonged here, in this place of lost souls. And then, the figure's mouth opened, stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Jack could hear the sound of a faint, guttural growl emanating from within, and the air seemed to vibrate with a low hum that made his teeth ache. The figure spoke, its voice both distant and intimate, reverberating through Jack's mind, his very bones. "You've crossed into the realm of the forgotten," it said, its voice a twisted echo of something ancient and untouchable. "There is no escape. There never was." Before Jack could even comprehend the words, the creature's hand closed around his throat. His body went limp as the coldness filled him entirely, his vision blurring. But even as his consciousness began to fade, he could feel the weight of the eyes, the thousands of eyes all upon him. And then, everything went silent. There was no more darkness, no more whispers, no more figure. For a long time, Jack floated in nothingness, unable to move, unable to think, as if he were a part of the very air, suspended between life and death. Then, finally, the silence was broken. A voice, soft, distant, yet so very clear, spoke from somewhere, far away but close enough to pierce through the void. "You are here now." The words lingered in Jack's mind like a slow-burning ember, the tone chilling yet oddly familiar. It wasn't the voice of the figure. This voice felt older, more fragmented, more like a memory that was trying to break through. Something deep within him stirred, but he couldn't grasp it. His entire being felt detached, as if his body were a distant echo of itself. "You have always been here," the voice continued, growing clearer with each word. "You are part of this place now. The forgotten, the lost." Jack wanted to scream. He wanted to break free from this suffocating emptiness. But there was no air to fill his lungs, no body to command. His consciousness, if he could even call it that, hung suspended in an inescapable void. Then, without warning, the world around him shifted. It wasn't like opening his eyes. It was more like a crack in the fabric of reality had been forced open. Jagged and distorted, the space around him stretched and twisted in unnatural shapes. And then he was no longer floating. Jack's feet were on solid ground again, though the sensation felt wrong. The ground was slick, not from rain or snow, but from something much darker, much older. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and a faint, haunting melody echoed through the suffocating silence, coming from nowhere yet everywhere at once. It was then that Jack saw it. A figure, human in shape but not quite right. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin a sickly, translucent gray that seemed to shimmer under the faint, flickering lights above. Its head tilted at an odd angle, the neck bending at an impossible curve, and though it had eyes, they were not eyes in the way Jack understood them. The pupils were too large, too dark, swallowing the light around them, making it impossible to tell where the figure began and where the shadows ended. For a moment, Jack stood frozen, paralyzed by the grotesque sight. Then the figure moved toward him, its steps silent but deliberate, as if it was in no hurry. Its elongated fingers twitched slightly as it reached out, the shadows around it seeming to pulse with a life of their own. Jack tried to back away, but his body moved sluggishly, like wading through thick tar. His legs wouldn't cooperate, and as much as he screamed in his mind, no sound escaped his lips. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a painful reminder of his helplessness. "You've crossed into a place that feeds on memories," the figure spoke, its voice a low rasp that reverberated through Jack's bones. "The memories of those who were too lost to leave. Those who wandered too far and forgot who they were." The words echoed through Jack's mind, and suddenly, flashes of his life, the life he thought he had left behind, flooded his consciousness. His name, his childhood, his family, his friends, they all came rushing back to him in an overwhelming wave, but they were not his memories anymore. They were twisted, distorted. Faces became unrecognizable. Events warped into something unholy. Jack tried to scream, but the air had thickened to the point where it was impossible to breathe, much less speak. The figure stepped closer, and Jack could feel its presence pressing in on him, suffocating him. "All of this place is built on the fragments of the forgotten," the figure continued. "You're just another piece, Jack. You've always been part of it." The figure reached out, its fingers brushing against Jack's arm. Cold seeped into his skin like ice, and with it came a flood of visions, flashes of memories that weren't his. They were from others who had passed through this place, their lives slipping away into the dark corners of this forgotten realm. Jack's mind fractured under the weight of it all. Faces, names, and places twisted into grotesque parodies of what they once were. He couldn't tell if the memories were his own anymore, or if they ever had been. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air that wasn't there. The world around him began to distort once more, the ground beneath him shifting like water, and the shadows pressed in from every side, their forms warping into grotesque shapes that writhed and twisted. The figure moved closer, its shadow swallowing Jack whole. "We are all forgotten here," it whispered, its voice no longer coming from its lips but from every corner of the void. "You'll join us soon, Jack, just like the others." Lost and forgotten, the last thing Jack saw before his vision blurred and his consciousness slipped away was the figure's eyes. Endless, dark, and consuming, pulling him into the abyss. Jack's senses faded slowly, like the final moments of a dream slipping away at the break of dawn. His body, now entirely numb, felt like it no longer belonged to him. But his mind was still there, anchored somewhere in the void, desperately clinging to something real. Time ceased to exist. The concept of it was gone, shredded by the overwhelming presence of the figure and the nightmare of memories that flooded his thoughts. He wasn't sure how long he had been trapped in this place, or if he had even been here for more than a few moments. The air, thick and suffocating, clung to his skin like oil, and the weight of the darkness pushed against him, a constant pressure that made him feel as if he were being crushed from all sides. The place, the forgotten realm, as the figure had called it, seemed to stretch on infinitely, no boundaries, no edges, just an endless expanse of nothing. The flickering lights that hung above him, though dim, were always present, casting harsh shadows that seemed to reach for him with each step he took. He tried to stand, but the ground beneath him was no longer solid. It pulsed, like a living thing, sending vibrations through his bones. His movements were sluggish, as if his body was weighed down by the air itself. He looked around, but there was no sign of the figure anymore. No sound except the distant hum of something that felt almost like a heartbeat. The memories were getting louder now. Each flash was sharper, more vivid, pulling him deeper into the web. He could hear the voices, the ones that came with the images, whispering to him, telling him things he couldn't understand. They were unfamiliar, yet there was a sickening familiarity in their tone, like voices he had once known but had long since forgotten. The ground beneath Jack trembled again, and his gaze snapped up. The darkness seemed to shift, a ripple passing through it like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. And then movement. A figure emerged from the shadows. This time it wasn't the same creature. No, this was something different. Something even worse. The figure was human, but it was wrong in ways that Jack couldn't fully comprehend. Its face was hollow, its features distorted beyond recognition, as if someone had tried to carve a face out of clay but had stopped halfway. Its skin was translucent, stretched thin, almost like it was just a layer of film over its bones, and its eyes. They were wide, far too wide, and full of an unnatural emptiness. The thing stepped forward, its body jerking in unnatural angles as it moved closer to Jack. There was no grace to its movement, only the erratic, frantic twitch of something desperate. Jack tried to move, to run, but his legs felt like lead, his body refusing to obey. It was as though the figure was pulling at him, draining him of his will. It stopped just in front of him, its hollow gaze fixed directly on Jack. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but silence, an oppressive stillness that suffocated him more than any noise ever could. The thing tilted its head, and Jack could hear the faintest whisper of a voice, one that sounded like the faintest memory of something once heard. "Join us." The words slithered into his mind, coiling around his thoughts like a snake, burrowing deep into his consciousness. Jack fought against it, fought against the invasive presence, but it was too late. The words were in him now, gnawing at him, tearing apart any resistance. The creature reached out with its long, skeletal hand, and Jack felt an overwhelming urge to let it touch him. He didn't know why, he couldn't explain it, but the pull was too strong. It was like a deep, insatiable hunger that he could not ignore. The touch was cold, ice cold. It seeped into his skin, into his veins, and Jack could feel something change inside him. His thoughts began to blur, his sense of self crumbling away as the figure's presence took over, filling him with an unbearable sense of wrongness. "You will never leave," the thing hissed, its voice now a cacophony of whispers that filled Jack's mind. "You belong here just like the others. You are one of us now." Jack screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the ever-expanding void. His body trembled violently as his memories, his very essence, began to dissolve into the darkness around him. He was no longer Jack. He was part of the place now, just another forgotten soul lost to the endless expanse of the void. And in the distance, somewhere beyond the reach of his shattered mind, the figure's hollow eyes gleamed in the dark, waiting for the next lost soul to wander in, to join them, to join the forgotten. "I apologize for the mistake earlier. I will continue in English as you requested." The darkness did not dissipate. Jack did not escape. The feeling of emptiness and despair wrapped around him with a tightening grip, and something terrible, settled deep in his mind. It was as if something was growing inside of him, something dark and foreign to his being. Like something was taking form, feeding on his consciousness, integrating itself into his soul. The figure before him, that distorted creature, was only beginning its work. And Jack felt like he couldn't fight it, as though he hadn't been the one to decide to fight in the first place. The sound of the creature's whisper grew louder. Every word it spoke felt like a wave crashing into his thoughts, eroding them, hollowing him out. We all do it. Everyone falls here, it echoed in his mind, each syllable a weight on his chest. With each whisper, Jack felt himself slipping further away from himself. He was no longer a person struggling to escape. He was just an entity, a presence without a body, empty and drifting in the endless space around him. The walls of the place, if there had ever been any, vanished, leaving only an unfathomable abyss of darkness and whispers. "Why?" Jack whimpered, his voice barely a whisper, lost in the sea of voices surrounding him. "Why are you doing this to me?" The creature didn't answer right away. Instead, its hollow eyes seemed to reflect Jack's anguish, his suffering pulsating in the depths of the void. And then, with a shudder, the creature spoke, its voice rougher, more distorted, as if the words themselves were twisting in its throat. "Because you found us. Everyone who's been here. They've done so without meaning to, but then they stay. There's no going back." The air around Jack grew thicker, as if every word from the creature made the space feel more oppressive, more crushing. He could feel it inside his chest now, the heavy presence of whatever force was taking over him. The creature's words were beginning to make sense, even if they didn't. Jack had never intended to come here. He hadn't planned on wandering into this nightmare. Yet now it seemed that fate had already chosen for him. "Stay with us," the creature continued, its voice now a whispering rasp that seemed to crawl under his skin. "You're just like the others. You'll stay too. We always do." Jack tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His body had long stopped obeying his commands. He could feel his thoughts slipping away, the fight draining from him as the creature's presence filled the air around him. It was as if the creature was not just within the room, but inside him, mingling with his own thoughts, with his very essence. "You're not alone," the creature whispered, "and you never will be." Jack tried to fight it. He tried to hold on to his sanity, but the darkness and the whispers were consuming him from within. Every part of him screamed for escape, but the more he fought, the more it felt like the creature had already won. The air grew colder, the silence punctuated by his erratic breathing and the faint, distant whispers of others who had fallen into this trap before him. He could feel their presence, not just in the room, but within him in the spaces between his thoughts. "Please," he begged, but the words fell into the abyss, swallowed by the overwhelming silence. The creature was now beside him, its cold breath grazing his ear. "There's no way out. Not for you. Not for anyone who enters here." Jack's mind began to unravel piece by piece. His body trembled uncontrollably as the realization sank in. He was never going to leave. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the mountains, casting an orange hue over the vast, open highway. Martin had driven this route countless times, yet the feeling of loneliness that crept over him each time was something he couldn't shake. The road stretched ahead, an endless ribbon of gray asphalt flanked by dense forests on either side. It was an old road, long since bypassed by the modern highways, but it was the quickest way out of the city and into the wilderness. He had always found something oddly calming about this stretch of the journey. It was quiet, too quiet at times, with only the occasional rustle of wind through the trees or the distant call of an animal. The hum of the engine and the soft glow of the dashboard lights were his only companions. The car's headlights cut through the growing dusk, the beam fading into the thickening fog that had begun to crawl along the ground. It seemed to come out of nowhere, as though the earth itself was exhaling mist. Martin adjusted the rearview mirror, noting how the last light of day clung to the horizon behind him. The road was empty, as it always was at this hour. There were no other travelers, no signs of life. The fog didn't bother him. It was part of the charm of this place. People in the city always warned him about driving here, but he had grown used to it. For him, it was just another stretch of road, albeit a bit more isolated, a bit more desolate. The air seemed to thicken as the fog grew denser. It wasn't the usual light mist that faded as quickly as it appeared. No, this fog had substance, a weight to it. It clung to the car like an invisible force, pressing against the windows as if trying to invade the cabin. Martin frowned, squinting through the windshield, trying to peer through the swirling haze. Something felt off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He reached for the dial on the dashboard to adjust the headlights, but when he turned it, the lights didn't brighten. Instead, the beam grew erratic, flickering. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, slapping the dashboard. The car jerked slightly, but the headlights remained dim and unsteady, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance across the trees and the road ahead. He let out a frustrated sigh and glanced at the rearview mirror, trying to gauge how far the fog had spread. That's when he saw it, a flash of movement in the distance. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light or perhaps the reflection of the fog itself. But then it came again, a figure, almost imperceptible in the haze, standing motionless in the middle of the road. Martin's heart skipped a beat, his foot instinctively lifting off the gas pedal as he slowed the car. The figure wasn't moving. It was just standing there, in the exact center of the road, as though waiting for him to approach. He could barely make out its shape, but what he saw made no sense. It wasn't a person, at least not in the way he understood. The figure was unnaturally thin, elongated almost to the point of distortion. Its limbs seemed too long, too angular, and its silhouette flickered like a mirage. The mist surrounding it seemed to swirl, as though it was part of the fog itself. Martin's breath caught in his throat. He didn't want to stop, didn't want to get closer, but his foot had frozen on the brake pedal. The car came to a halt a few feet away from the figure. The fog enveloped it completely, swallowing the figure whole. For a long moment, Martin sat motionless, his eyes locked on the place where the figure had been, waiting for it to reappear, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. But there was only the hum of the engine, the fog pressing against the car like an invisible force. He reached for the door handle, his hands trembling, unsure whether to leave the car or keep driving. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to forget the shortcut and take the long way around. But his curiosity, or perhaps some deep, irrational need, drove him to step out of the car. His boots crunched softly against the road as he stepped into the thick fog, every movement feeling slower, as if the very air was pushing against him. The world around him felt heavy, like something was waiting to happen. A sudden, sharp crack echoed in the distance, like a branch snapping under the weight of something enormous. He stopped dead in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound came again, this time closer, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging along the ground. "Hello!" Martin called out, his voice barely more than a whisper, swallowed almost immediately by the fog. Nothing answered, but he could feel something, an oppressive presence, just beyond his reach. Something was there, and it wasn't human. The fog began to dissipate slightly, and the figure reappeared. A shadow among shadows, standing at the edge of the road. Martin's breath hitched. It hadn't moved, but now he could make out a shape that seemed to defy the natural world. It wasn't a man, nor was it an animal. It was something else entirely, something that didn't belong in the world he knew. And as he stared at it, his mind felt as though it was being pulled in every direction, like the fog was slowly wrapping around his thoughts, suffocating them. Martin's instincts screamed at him to run, but his body refused to obey. The figure remained motionless, and all he could do was stare at it, frozen in place. The fog seemed to thicken again, swirling around Martin in tight spirals, as though it was alive. Every breath he took felt colder than the last, the air thick with a strange, metallic scent. He couldn't take his eyes off the figure, the way it stood there, unmoving and silent. The sound of the dragging grew louder, unmistakable now. His heartbeat raced in time with the echoing noise. The figure didn't blink. It didn't seem to breathe. Its outline flickered in and out, as if it was unstable, as though it was tethered to some other reality. Every time the fog shifted, its shape seemed to alter slightly, distorting like a reflection on water. Martin's body felt stiff, as though every muscle was slowly being drained of its strength. His feet remained rooted to the road, the grip of some unseen force keeping him there. Another crack echoed, closer this time, followed by a low, guttural growl, the kind that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand at attention. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he tore his eyes away from the figure. The road around him seemed to stretch longer, the darkness deeper. The fog that had once been a mere inconvenience now felt like it was suffocating him, closing in on every side. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to run back to the car, but he couldn't seem to move. The growling came again, louder, unmistakably closer. It was not the sound of an animal. It was something larger, something that had no right to exist. And then, amidst the fog, he saw it: movement, the shape of a shadow moving at the edge of his vision, too quick for him to properly focus on. It was like a blur, but not. The air vibrated with a low hum, like the ground beneath him was resonating with some deep, dark force. The figure, if it could still be called that, was now joined by something else. A shape, barely discernible at first, but then it came into view with horrifying clarity. A massive, contorted body, its proportions grotesque, as though the laws of nature had bent around it. Its limbs were too long, too many, twisted in impossible angles, and its skin, if it could even be called that, was a sickly shade of gray, mottled and fleshy. It was dragging something behind it, a tangle of limbs, and the sound of bones scraping against the ground sent a jolt of terror through Martin's core. The figure in the fog seemed to smile, though the mouth was too wide, too jagged to be anything human. A laugh, no, a rasp, slipped from its throat, a sound like metal grinding against metal. "Help me," it whispered, its voice both familiar and foreign, like an old friend's voice distorted beyond recognition. The air grew colder still. The fog swirled faster around him, pressing against his skin, choking him with its weight. The words seemed to echo inside his mind, reverberating in the space between his thoughts. He snapped back to reality with a gasp. The air around him was thick, suffocating. He turned back to the car, and for a brief moment he thought he saw it. A flicker of movement near the front bumper. But when he blinked, it was gone. His breath quickened, his pulse pounding in his ears. He knew he had to run. He had to make it back to the car. The growl grew louder, closer now, closer than ever. But this time there was something else. A hiss, like air escaping from a punctured tire. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and then he saw it. The fog shifted once more, and the figure, no longer a shadow, stepped fully into view. Its face, if it could be called that, was a twisted mockery of humanity. Eyes too large, mouth too wide. His teeth gleamed in the dim light, sharp as razors. It took one slow, deliberate step toward him, and with every movement, the air seemed to grow heavier. The space around him felt wrong, distorted. "Help me," it whispered again, the same voice, the same haunting rasp. But now Martin realized it wasn't the figure that spoke. It was the fog. The ground beneath his feet trembled harder now, the road warping, bending in ways that defied logic. He turned back to the car, but it was no longer there. The vehicle had vanished, swallowed by the ever-deepening fog. The forest was now silent. Even the wind had stopped. There was no sound of animals, no distant hum of traffic, nothing. Only the low, rasping voice of the figure, getting closer, growing louder. The fog had thickened around him to the point where it was all he could see. The road had disappeared. The trees had disappeared. Everything had disappeared, except for the figure, and the strange sound that seemed to fill his ears, like whispering. Martin's legs began to move, though he didn't remember deciding to run. His feet carried him across uneven terrain, through the fog, but it felt like the ground itself was shifting, pulling him deeper into this impossible place. He could no longer tell which direction he was heading, the fog blurring his sense of reality. Each breath was harder to take, like the air itself was choking him. Somewhere, in the distance, a laugh echoed. It wasn't the figure that laughed, though. No, the laugh came from somewhere deeper within the fog, somewhere darker, colder. It felt like the very essence of the place was alive and mocking him. Martin kept running, heart racing, legs screaming in protest. But with every step, the fog grew thicker, and he realized he couldn't escape. He was trapped. The fog closed in around Martin, thickening to the point where it felt like it was physically pressing against him, as if it were a living entity determined to swallow him whole. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision reduced to mere inches in front of him, the darkness creeping ever closer. The ground beneath him seemed to undulate, twisting and contracting with each step he took, like he was no longer running on solid earth but something far more unstable, something alien. His feet slid across the slippery road, the asphalt giving way beneath him as if the very foundation of the world had started to crumble. The sound of his frantic footsteps became muffled, drowned out by the growing hum in the air, a low, reverberating vibration that thrummed deep in his chest, rattling his bones. It was everywhere, the hum of something unseen, something that had been waiting for him to cross the threshold. "Help me," the voice whispered again, but this time, it didn't just come from one direction. Surrounded him. It was in his head, echoing within his skull, making his eyes dart frantically around. The fog was alive, alive with memories, with ghosts, with forgotten whispers of something terrible. And as much as he tried to focus on the distant sounds of the figure's footsteps, he could no longer tell where they were coming from. They were all around him, indistinct but undeniable. His pulse quickened. He had no idea where he was anymore. The road, the trees, the sky, they were gone, swallowed by the fog, the landscape now an endless void of gray and white. The cold had seeped deep into his skin, like ice water filling his veins. He shivered uncontrollably, the numbing cold pressing in around him, stealing the warmth from his limbs. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched something solid, something warm. It was the trunk of a tree, the bark rough under his fingertips, but it didn't help him. Nothing would help him, not the trees, not the fog, not even the desperate urge to escape. The faint crack of a twig breaking underfoot made his head snap up, but he saw nothing through the mist, only the dense, swirling fog and the vague, shifting shapes within it. His throat tightened with panic, and his chest felt like it was closing in on itself. What was this place? Where was he? Then, without warning, the air grew still. The hum stopped, the whispers died, and then he heard something else. A rustling, soft at first, like the sound of wind through leaves. But it wasn't wind. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Something was moving toward him through the fog, slowly, carefully. Something with purpose. "Help me." The voice was closer now, impossibly close. It was the figure, but it wasn't just the figure anymore. It was the very fog itself speaking. The voices of countless people, twisted and distorted, layered on top of each other, all pleading, all crying out. He turned his head to the side, and there it was. The shadow, the figure he had seen earlier, but now it was different. It had grown. It wasn't just one shape anymore. It had multiplied, splitting into countless forms, all interconnected by dark tendrils of something not quite solid. The shapes writhed and shifted in the mist, their outlines blurring and merging together in a grotesque dance. The creature, or creatures, moved closer to him, the tendrils of its mass undulating with every inch. Each new shape that emerged from the fog seemed to pull him deeper, forcing his attention to focus on it, as though it were drawing him into its web. The cold grew unbearable, but not in the way he was used to. It wasn't just the cold that seeped into his bones. It was the sensation of something wrong in the air, something insidious, like the world itself was twisting around him, dragging him into the dark center of something ancient and malevolent. The ground shook beneath his feet again, stronger this time, and Martin stumbled, barely catching himself. He was on the edge of losing control. His breathing became more erratic, shallow gasps as panic overtook him. He tried to run but found himself unable to move, his feet heavy, as though the fog itself had wrapped around his legs, chaining him to the ground. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking with fear. "Please, just let me go." But the figures, no, they stopped in front of him. The closest one, its face a nightmare of twisted features, leaned in close. It didn't speak. Instead, its eyes, two black voids, stared into his soul. And in that moment, Martin understood. It wasn't trying to help him. It wasn't trying to end his suffering. It wanted him to join it. The voice from before, the one that had whispered, "Help me," now felt different, more insistent, more desperate. The ground around him seemed to pulse with energy, and his vision blurred, the fog swirling into a vortex, spiraling around him as though the world itself were coming undone. The whispering voices from the fog began to merge into one unified sound. It was the sound of the place, a deep, gnawing, insistent hum that filled every inch of his mind. It was the sound of 1,000 souls trapped in this nightmare, screaming to be freed. But Martin couldn't move. He was trapped, and as the figures reached out with their elongated arms, their cold, skeletal hands brushing against his skin, he felt the coldness of death creeping into his veins. The figure's face stretched into a grotesque smile, and in that smile, he saw the horrors of every life that had come before him. The faces of those who had wandered here, those who had been consumed by the fog. A hand reached out from the darkness, and Martin felt it touch his chest, its fingers ice cold. There was no escape now. The fog, the whispers, the figures, they all converged on him, pulling him into the depths of their endless, eternal void. And with one final, tortured scream, Martin was gone. Despite the growing panic in his chest, Martin forced himself to keep moving. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around him, but he couldn't stop. The road stretched out before him like an endless tunnel. The shadows of trees lining the sides seemed to shift, as if something were dragging them. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't natural. There was something else in the air. Suddenly, the temperature dropped drastically, as though death itself had descended upon the pavement. Martin wrapped his arms around himself, his breath coming out in clouds, a sign of the nightmare becoming his reality. A sound in the distance, something crackling, something rough, began to grow louder. He couldn't pinpoint its origin. Was it his car, or something else? A whisper brushed his ear, low and guttural, as if it were coming from deep inside his mind. He snapped out of his thoughts as the sound of a vehicle approached, but it wasn't a car. It was the sound of something dragging itself slowly, heavily, like an animal dragging its body. Martin couldn't understand, but fear paralyzed him. He thought about turning back, but the air pressed him forward, an invisible force pushing him toward the unknown. Then suddenly he saw something on the horizon. It wasn't a car or even a human shape. It was a figure, completely dark with blurry edges, moving toward him. Its body moved in an impossible way, as if it was distorting itself. Martin froze in place. It was almost as though it was being pulled forward, yet he knew it was moving on its own, too slowly, too deliberately. The figure drew closer, its movements unnatural and jerky. Martin's heart hammered in his chest as his mind screamed for him to run, but his legs refused to move. The dark shape seemed to stretch and warp, becoming less and less human the closer it got. It had no distinct features, just a shadow, a void that devoured light, with the outline of something wrong, something that should never be. As the creature came within a few feet of him, the temperature plummeted even further. Martin could see his breath now, visible in the air, thick and misty. A strange, faint humming sound filled the silence, like something buzzing beneath the earth itself. It was too loud to ignore, but too low to identify. The figure stopped right in front of him, and for a moment, everything went still. Martin felt the cold seeping into his bones, the weight of something unseen pressing on his chest. Then it moved, slowly at first, its limbs bending and twisting in ways that made Martin's stomach churn. It reached out with one of its long, contorted arms, extending a hand toward him. He could feel its gaze, though he couldn't see its eyes. It was as if it was studying him, deciding something. A voice, deep and garbled, emanated from the thing. It sounded like a whisper mixed with static, but there was an unsettling clarity in its words. "You shouldn't have come here." Before Martin could react, the air around him seemed to compress, the pressure building up until his head felt like it was about to explode. He gasped, his breath short, his body frozen in place. The creature's hand moved closer, and in a panic, Martin forced himself to stumble backward, his legs finally betraying him and sending him crashing to the ground. The thing tilted its head, as if amused, before its body shifted violently. It split apart in an instant, becoming a swarm of dark tendrils that shot toward him like lightning. Martin tried to scream, but no sound came. His vision blurred, and the world around him warped. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the monstrous, endless void swallowing him whole. Martin's world was pitch black. The only sensation he had was an overwhelming sense of weightlessness, as if he were suspended in a vast, empty space. Time seemed irrelevant. There was no up, no down, no movement. His mind spun, disoriented, struggling to grasp any thread of logic or reality. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to wake up, to escape, but there was no escape from the cold embrace of the void. The humming sound returned, now more intense, vibrating through his body like a low, persistent growl. It was like a heartbeat, but far too deep, too primal. Then he felt it, a pressure against his chest. At first, it was subtle, but it grew stronger with each passing second, as if something was pushing against him from all sides. His ribs ached, his lungs struggled to expand, and a deep, crushing sensation began to take hold. It felt like he was being drawn into something far more dangerous than he could comprehend. Suddenly, the air shifted, and light broke through the blackness, but it was not the comforting light of day. It was an oppressive, unnatural glow, sickly and greenish, like the sickening light that comes from the depths of a swamp. The pressure on his chest released slightly, but the sensation of being watched did not. He could feel eyes, hundreds of them, staring at him from every direction. He couldn't see them, but he knew they were there. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as a cold whisper filled his mind. "You are not meant to be here." The voice was 1,000 voices, all overlapping, each one more distorted than the last. It resonated deep within his soul, a gnawing presence that seemed to sink into his very thoughts. It felt ancient, as though it came from something that existed long before humanity, long before Earth itself. In that moment, Martin realized the truth. This place, this space, was not a simple void. It was something else. A prison, a trap, a place of eternal confinement. The creature, or whatever it had been, was not merely an entity. It was a gatekeeper, a watcher, ensuring that no one ever left once they entered. Martin tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. His mind raced, and in the chaotic scramble for clarity, a distant memory surfaced. Something about the curse of the road, something his friend Dylan had mentioned. But the memory was fragmented, lost in the terror that gripped him now. A flash of light, bright and blinding, ripped through the space. The light came from nowhere and everywhere, its intensity burning into his vision. He could feel his skin searing, the heat unbearable, yet there was no way to escape it. His body screamed in agony, but there was no sound. The light expanded, and as it did, he felt himself drawn toward it, toward something else, something that promised an end to the void. In that moment, a shape emerged from the light, an elongated figure, translucent and shimmering, with a face so twisted it defied comprehension. It was humanoid, but its proportions were wrong. Its limbs were impossibly long, its body ethereal. Its eyes were dark, hollow voids, and it was staring directly at him. Martin tried to move, but his limbs were frozen in place. He wanted to run, to fight, to scream, but the creature's gaze held him captive. The figure extended one of its long, slender arms toward him, its hand opening wide, its fingers bending unnaturally, each joint cracking like dry twigs. "You should not have seen us." The words filled his mind again, their meaning sinking in deeper, twisting like a knife in his chest. The creature's arm continued to stretch forward, and Martin knew. that there would be no escape. There would be no coming back. This was the end. The hand was now inches from his face, and as it touched his skin, his body froze completely. He could feel the cold seep into his bones, the icy touch spreading like poison, paralyzing him. His breath stopped, his heart stopped, and his mind became nothing but static, endless, drowning static. But then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the pressure ceased. The light flickered and died. The sound of the humming stopped. The weightlessness vanished. Martin's body collapsed, lifeless, into the void. And then, as if to erase his existence from every corner of the universe, the creature whispered one last time, "We will never forget." The first time we heard it, we thought it was the wind. I was part of a marine research team stationed at a remote facility off the northern coast. Our work revolved around mapping the ocean floor, cataloging marine life, and monitoring seismic activity. The ocean held mysteries that fascinated us, but we never imagined the kind of mystery that would find us. The facility, dubbed Deepwatch Station, was a steel labyrinth perched precariously on the edge of the continental shelf. It was isolated, cut off from the world save for monthly supply runs and the occasional message through the satellite uplink. There were 6 of us in total: Dr. Kaminsky, our lead researcher, Val, the marine biologist, Diego, the tech specialist, Sandra, the seismic analyst, Jonas, the engineer, and me, a junior researcher fresh out of grad school. It began during a routine dive. The station's ROV, remotely operated vehicle, had been sent down to explore a particularly deep trench. It was the kind of abyss that swallowed light, where even the ROV's powerful floodlights barely illuminated the rocky walls. Sandra monitored the seismic data while Diego piloted the ROV with practiced precision. Getting some interference, Diego muttered, tapping the monitor. The feed from the ROV flickered, static washing across the screen. "What kind of interference?" Dr. Kaminsky asked, leaning over his shoulder. "Not sure," Diego replied. "It's not the equipment. Could be something environmental." Then we heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound coming through the ROV's hydrophone. It wasn't the usual clicks and calls of marine life, nor the groaning of shifting tectonic plates. This was something else entirely. The sound was low, almost melodic, and eerily human-like. It came in bursts, like whispers carried through the water. "What is that?" Val asked, her face pale as she listened. "Maybe a whale," Dr. Kaminsky suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Whales don't go that deep," Val countered. Diego adjusted the hydrophone, trying to isolate the source, but the sound grew fainter until it was gone. For the next few days, the sound haunted us. Val reviewed hours of hydrophone recordings, searching for any trace of it. "It's like nothing I've ever heard," she said one night, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Kaminsky seemed equally obsessed. He pored over spectrograms, comparing the sound to known marine species, but nothing matched. Meanwhile, the rest of us tried to carry on with our work, but the atmosphere in the station had shifted. The isolation, which had once been a welcome escape from the chaos of the surface world, now felt oppressive. The whispers returned a week later. This time, they were louder. The ROV was in the water again, exploring a series of caverns near the trench. The hydrophone picked up the whispers almost immediately. "Do you hear that?" Diego asked, his hands tightening on the controls. We all crowded around the monitor, listening in tense silence. The whispers seemed closer now, more distinct. They came in bursts of 3 or 4, then stopped, as if waiting for a response. "It's a pattern," Sandra said, her eyes wide. "Almost like speech." "Speech?" Jonas scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. It's probably just a current or something bouncing off the walls of the trench." But it didn't sound like a current. And when Diego rotated the ROV to face the open ocean, the whispers stopped. For the rest of the night, the whispers echoed in my mind. I lay awake in my bunk, staring at the ceiling as the hum of the station's machinery filled the silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something vast and ancient lurking in the depths. The others felt it too. Over the next few days, the tension in the station grew palpable. Conversations became terse, and laughter, a rare but cherished commodity in our isolated world, disappeared entirely. Then the lights started flickering. The first blackout happened during a storm. The ocean surface above us was a churning mass of waves and wind, and the station groaned under the pressure. When the lights flickered and went out, Jonas assured us it was just a temporary power fluctuation. But the whispers returned during the blackout. We huddled in the control room, lit only by the dim glow of emergency lights. The hydrophone, still active, crackled to life. This time, the whispers weren't faint. They were clear, almost deafening. And they weren't random. The bursts of sound came faster now, overlapping each other like voices in an argument. "It's angry," Val whispered, her face pale. We sat in stunned silence, the whispers clawing at the edges of reason. They reverberated through the hydrophone, each burst of sound sharper and more deliberate. The rhythm was erratic now, like it was trying to force something out, a message we weren't equipped to understand. Jonas was the first to break the silence. "It's just feedback," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "The storm's messing with the equipment. That's all." "No," Val snapped, her hands trembling as she gripped the table. "That's not feedback. That's something." Diego leaned closer to the monitor, sweat glistening on his forehead. "It's moving," he said, pointing to the ROV's sonar display. We all crowded around. A shape, indistinct and massive, drifted across the screen. It wasn't a whale, or a school of fish, or anything that should have been there. It was too big. The power returned a few minutes later, flooding the control room with harsh fluorescent light. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it felt suffocating. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice breaking. Dr. Kaminsky didn't answer. He was staring at the sonar display, his face ashen. "We need to document this," he said finally. "Whatever it is, it's unprecedented." "Document it?" Val echoed. "Are you insane? We need to leave." "No one's leaving," Kaminsky said, his tone sharp. "This is the opportunity of a lifetime." Against our better judgment, we stayed. The next day, Kaminsky ordered another dive. Diego protested, but the doctor was insistent. "We're here to study the unknown," he said. "And that's exactly what we're going to do." The ROV descended into the trench once more, its lights cutting through the inky blackness. We watched in tense silence as the feed flickered and stabilized. The whispers returned almost immediately. They were louder now, impossibly loud, as if the source was right next to the hydrophone. The ROV's cameras picked up nothing but endless darkness. And then, the feed cut out. Diego frantically worked the controls, trying to re-establish the connection. "I've lost it," he said, his voice tight with panic. "Something's interfering with the signal." "Bring it back," Kaminsky ordered. "I'm trying." The screen remained black, the only sound a faint crackle of static. Then, without warning, the feed returned. But it wasn't the trench we were looking at. The camera was somewhere else entirely. The walls were smooth, almost organic, glistening with a strange, iridescent sheen. The lights of the ROV flickered, casting eerie shadows that writhed and shifted like living things. "What is that?" Sandra whispered, leaning closer. Before anyone could answer, something moved across the screen. It was fast, too fast to make out, but the shape was unmistakably wrong. The feed cut out again, plunging the room into silence. "We need to retrieve the ROV," Kaminsky said, though his voice wavered. Diego shook his head. "I can't. It's not responding to commands." "Then we go down ourselves," Kaminsky said. "You're joking," Val said, staring at him in disbelief. "I'm not," he replied. "If we leave now, we'll never know what we saw." "You don't want to know," Val shot back. "Whatever's down there, it's not meant for us." Kaminsky won the argument, as he always did. By the end of the day, we were prepping the station's submersible for a manned dive. Kaminsky insisted on going, along with Diego and me. The others stayed behind, their unease palpable. As the submersible descended, the whispers grew louder, reverberating through the hull like a chorus of disjointed voices. "They are below us," Kaminsky said, his eyes fixed on the sonar. I didn't ask who they were. When we reached the trench, the lights of the submersible illuminated the walls, revealing strange markings etched into the rock. They were intricate and geometric, yet somehow organic, like they'd been grown rather than carved. "What the hell is this?" Diego muttered, his voice shaking. Kaminsky didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the sonar, where the massive shape had reappeared. "It's here," he said, his voice filled with awe. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of overlapping sounds that seemed to burrow into my skull. And then we saw it. The shape emerged from the darkness, its size incomprehensible. It wasn't a creature, it was an absence, a void that seemed to consume light and sound. The whispers emanated from it, though they felt less like sounds and more like thoughts forced into our minds. Kaminsky reached out toward the viewport, as if trying to touch the void. "Don't," Diego hissed, pulling him back. But it was too late. The submersible shook violently, and the lights flickered. The last thing I saw before the feed cut out was Kaminsky's face, twisted in an expression of pure terror. When I woke up, I was back in the station. Sandra and Jonas found me floating in the submersible's emergency pod, unconscious and alone. There was no sign of Kaminsky or Diego, and the submersible itself was gone. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. Every time I thought about the void, my mind recoiled, as if trying to protect me from something I wasn't meant to remember. The whispers haven't stopped. They follow me now, no matter where I go. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I feel the void watching. The Echoes of Hollow Pine. Fragment 1. The Invitation. It started with an envelope. A plain, white envelope slipped under my apartment door late one night. At first, I thought it was a mistake, some neighbor's forgotten delivery, but my name was scrawled across the front in black ink. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You are cordially invited to witness the unveiling of the Hollow Pines estate. Midnight, October 31st. The invitation bore no further instructions, no RSVP. It only had the address, a remote location in the middle of nowhere, and a strange insignia stamped at the bottom. A skeletal tree, its roots twisting into a spiraling abyss. I should have ignored it, thrown it out, moved on. But there was something about the phrasing, the sinister simplicity of it, that burrowed into my thoughts. By the time Halloween arrived, I found myself driving down an overgrown road, headlights cutting through the dense fog of hollow pines. Fragment 2. The Arrival. The estate emerged from the darkness like a monolith. It was massive, Victorian, and decayed, the kind of place that felt alive in its emptiness. Ivy crawled up its cracked walls, and shattered windows reflected the pale moonlight like jagged teeth. I parked in the gravel driveway and stepped out into the freezing night air. The woods around me were unnaturally still, no sound save for the faint rustle of dead leaves underfoot. Other cars were parked nearby, their occupants standing in hushed groups. I recognized no one, though they all seemed as uneasy as I felt. A man stood on the mansion steps, tall and thin, dressed in a dark suit. He held a lantern that cast long, flickering shadows across his face. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and commanding. "Welcome to Hollow Pines. Please, come inside." Fragment 3. The Gathering. The foyer was suffocating. Dust hung thick in the air, and the faded wallpaper peeled back in strips, revealing rotting wood beneath. A massive chandelier dangled precariously above us, its crystals coated in grime. There were perhaps 20 of us, strangers united by the same cryptic invitation. No one spoke much. The air was charged with tension, an unspoken agreement that we were all in the wrong place but too curious, or too afraid, to leave. The man in the suit led us deeper into the mansion, his lantern swinging in time with his steps. He didn't introduce himself, nor did he explain why we were there. We passed through a series of increasingly decrepit rooms, each colder and darker than the last, until we reached a grand hall at the mansion's heart. At the center of the hall was a table, long and wooden, covered in a black velvet cloth. On it sat a single object, a box, ornate and ancient, its surface engraved with the same skeletal tree insignia from the invitation. "The unveiling will begin shortly," the man announced. Fragment 4, the box. No one moved as the man approached the table. His fingers brushed the box's lid, tracing the intricate carvings as if savoring the moment. "I trust you all understand the significance of this gathering," he said, his voice calm. "You have been chosen not by chance, but by destiny. The box before you is an artifact of great power, a doorway to truths long buried." A woman near me scoffed. "Is this some kind of prank? Who even are you?" The man ignored her. He opened the box with a deliberate slowness, and for a moment, I thought it was empty. Then, I saw it. A black, swirling mist coiling inside like smoke trapped in glass. It wasn't natural. It shifted in ways that defied logic, almost as if it were alive. "What is that?" someone whispered. "The essence of hollow pines," the man replied. Fragment 5, the first volunteer. "I will need a volunteer," the man continued, his gaze sweeping over us. No one stepped forward. The silence grew heavy, the kind that demanded action yet paralyzed you from taking it. Finally, a man in his 40s, broad-shouldered, wearing a leather jacket, spoke up. "I'll do it," he said, his voice braver than his eyes. The suited man smiled faintly. "Thank you, Mr. Whitaker." Whitaker approached the table, visibly nervous. The man in the suit gestured for him to place his hand into the box. "You must trust the process," he said. Whitaker hesitated, then plunged his hand into the swirling mist. At first, nothing happened. Then, his expression twisted in agony. He let out a choked scream, his body convulsing violently as the mist seemed to climb up his arm, burrowing into his skin. When it was over, he collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. "What did you see?" the man asked. Whitaker's eyes were wide and unfocused. I saw it. I saw it," he stammered, his voice cracking. "It's real." "What's real?" someone demanded. Whitaker didn't answer. Fragment 6, the descent. The volunteers came one by one after that, each drawn to the box as if compelled by an unseen force. Some emerged shaking and incoherent. Others refused to speak at all. When my turn came, I tried to resist. But the man's voice was insistent, and the pull of the box was undeniable. The moment my hand touched the mist, I was no longer in the hall. I was in the woods, standing at the base of the skeletal tree. Its branches stretched impossibly high, twisting like veins into the starless sky. Beneath its roots was an open moor, a swirling black void that seemed to pulse with life. And from the void came whispers. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, yet the meaning was clear: surrender. Fragment 7, the revelation. When I woke, I was back in the hall. My hand burned where the mist had touched it, and my mind was filled with images of the tree, the void, and the whispers. "You've seen it, haven't you?" the suited man asked. I nodded, unable to speak. "The truth of hollow pines is now within you," he said. "You have been marked." "What happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Now, the unveiling begins in earnest." Fragment 8, the awakening. The lights in the hall flickered, then went out completely. The air grew colder, and the whispers began again. This time louder, more insistent. The box on the table shattered, releasing a torrent of black mist that filled the room. Shapes moved within it, impossibly large and inhuman, their eyes glowing like embers in the dark. Panic erupted. People screamed, ran for the doors, but the mist was everywhere, suffocating and alive. I stumbled backward, my vision blurring. In the chaos, I saw the suited man standing perfectly still, his arms outstretched as if welcoming the creatures. "This is their domain," he said, his voice echoing. "And we are but their instruments." Fragment 9, the escape. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling through the woods, the whispers fading behind me. The estate was gone, replaced by an expanse of trees that stretched endlessly in all directions. I don't know how long I ran before I collapsed, gasping for air. When I looked up, I saw it again. The skeletal tree, its roots coiled around the edge of the void. The whispers returned, louder this time, and I knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that I could never escape Hollow Pines. Fragment 10, The Return. I woke to the sound of rustling leaves. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, and my limbs felt heavy as if weighted by an unseen force. The skeletal tree loomed ahead, its gnarled branches swaying despite the absence of wind. I tried to stand, but my legs buckled beneath me. Crawling forward, I realized the ground wasn't just dirt. It was moving. Tiny, writhing forms squirmed beneath my hands, vanishing into the soil as soon as I noticed them. The whispers began again, soft and rhythmic, growing louder with each passing second. They were no longer confined to my mind. They were all around me, echoing from the shadows, each voice overlapping the next in a chaotic symphony. "You were chosen," the voices said in unison. "For what?" I croaked, my throat dry and raw. "To carry the seed," they replied. Fragment 11, The Seed. The words filled me with a dread I couldn't name. I clawed at my chest, desperate to feel normalcy beneath my skin, but there was something wrong. Something alien. Beneath my ribs, I felt movement. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse of my heartbeat, but something else. Something alive. My breathing quickened, and I tore at my shirt, exposing my chest. A faint glow pulsed beneath the surface of my skin, spreading out in web-like patterns that pulsed in time with the whispers. "No, no, no," I muttered, stumbling backward. The skeletal tree seemed closer now, its roots stretching toward me like grasping fingers. I turned to run, but the forest had closed in around me. The path was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of twisting branches and suffocating mist. "Do not resist," the voices commanded. Fragment 12, The Pursuers. Panic surged as I sprinted blindly through the woods. The ground beneath me seemed to shift with every step, and the whispers grew louder, angrier. Shadows darted through the trees, humanoid shapes that moved too fast, too fluidly to be human. They were hunting me. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. Every time I glanced back, the shadows were closer, their glowing eyes burning into my soul. Ahead, a faint light flickered through the trees. It was weak and unsteady, but it was enough to push me forward. I burst into a clearing and collapsed, gasping for air. The light came from a lantern held by a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was the suited man. Fragment 13, The Bargain. "You cannot outrun them," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos around us. What do they want from me?" I managed to gasp. He knelt beside me, his lantern casting shadows across his face. "Hollow Pines is a threshold, a place where the veil between worlds is thin. The beings you saw, they exist beyond our comprehension. And you," he paused, his smile chilling, "you've been marked as their vessel." I didn't agree to this. I shouted. He tilted his head. "You came here, did you not? You accepted the invitation. That was enough." I tried to argue, but the words caught in my throat. The glow beneath my skin was brighter now, spreading further with each passing second. "There is a way to stop it," he said, his tone almost pitying. "But it comes at a cost." "What cost?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. He leaned closer, his eyes gleaming. "You must return to the tree. Complete the cycle. Only then will they release you." Fragment 14, The Descent. With no other choice, I followed him. The shadows continued to close in, their whispers now a deafening roar, but the suited man seemed unaffected. His lantern cut through the mist, illuminating a narrow path that hadn't been there before. The tree loomed ahead, its roots pulsing with the same eerie glow as my skin. The void beneath it churned, emitting a low, guttural sound that resonated in my chest. "This is where it ends," the man said, stopping at the edge of the clearing. I turned to him, my heart pounding. "What happens if I don't do this?" His smile was faint but cruel. "You'll become one of them," The ground beneath me began to shake, and the whispers reached a fever pitch. The shadows were closer now, their forms distorted and grotesque. With a trembling hand, I stepped toward the tree. Fragment 15. The Offering. The air grew thick as I approached the void. The glow beneath my skin pulsed in rhythm with the tree's roots, and I felt an overwhelming pull toward the darkness. The whispers turned into a chant, their words unintelligible yet commanding. As I stood at the edge of the void, a single command echoed in my mind. Release it. Instinctively, I raised my hands, and the glow beneath my skin intensified. The pain was unbearable, like fire coursing through my veins, but I couldn't stop. The light flowed from me into the void, and the whispers grew louder, almost triumphant. The shadows halted, their forms trembling as the light consumed them. Then, silence. Fragment 16. The Aftermath. When I woke, the tree was gone. The void, the shadows, the whispers, all of it had vanished. I was lying in the middle of the forest, the morning sun filtering through the branches above. For a moment, I thought it was over, but as I stood, I noticed something strange. The glow beneath my skin was gone, but a faint, pulsing mark had appeared on my palm, the skeletal tree. The suited man's voice echoed in my mind. Hollow pines never truly lets go. Through the Darkness. Part 1. The Pattern. The city never sleeps. It never has. Its pulse beats through the concrete veins of every street, alley, and building. There's a hum that you can feel at the back of your skull, a constant undercurrent of noise. The distant roar of traffic, the shuffle of feet on the sidewalk, the murmur of conversations in cafes and bars. But underneath all of that, there is something else. Something quieter. Something more sinister. I've spent my career chasing shadows, watching people and places with a steady hand, trying to find the patterns hidden beneath the noise. It's what I do. It's what I've always done. But even I couldn't have prepared myself for this. I'm Detective Samuel Daniels, and I've been on the force for 15 years. That's long enough to know when something isn't right. And this was wrong. The first body was discovered a week ago. The victim, a young woman in her 20s, was found in an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. No signs of struggle, no obvious injuries. It looked like she had just collapsed, but the smell of something sickly sweet lingered in the air. She had been strangled, that much was clear. At first, we thought it was just another case of a random killing, a mugging gone wrong, a drug deal turned violent. But then the second body turned up. Same place, same circumstances, same smell. It was the pattern that hooked me. The third victim was found in the same location, her body discarded like the others. Same story, same haunting absence of evidence. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses, and no trace of the killer. It was as if these people had simply disappeared, only to reappear in death, in the same place, under the same circumstances. I don't believe in coincidences. Not anymore. I stared at the photos of the victims. All of them were young women, each with dark hair and pale skin, their faces frozen in a state of fear or surprise. I could see it in their eyes. They knew something was coming, but they never had the chance to fight it. I rubbed my face, my mind racing. Something didn't sit right with me. There was a coldness in these deaths, a calculated, almost clinical efficiency that spoke of a mind more detached from humanity than I cared to think about. These were not crimes of passion. These were deliberate, methodical killings, carried out with an almost surgical precision. I grabbed my coat and headed out to the crime scene. The abandoned building was cold, the kind of cold that cuts through to your bones. The air was stale, thick with dust and the faint odor of mold. The room where the bodies had been found was empty now, save for the faint outline of where they had once lain. Yellow police tape still crisscrossed the doorframe, and the remnants of chalk outlines marked the floor. I could see the traces of blood that had been scrubbed away but never truly erased. And the smell, it lingered, a faint, cloying sweetness that made my stomach churn. It was like the smell of something rotting, something forgotten. I crouched down and ran my hand over the floor, trying to find something, anything, that could give me a lead. There was nothing, just dust and dirt. But I wasn't going to give up so easily. I stood up and walked deeper into the building, scanning every inch of it, hoping to find something that would tie this place to the killer. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on me. "Detective," one of the officers called. "You might want to see this." I followed him down the hall, my steps slow and deliberate. When we reached the back room, I saw it. A single piece of paper, pinned to the wall with a rusty nail. The edges were frayed, and the ink had faded with time. But the message was clear. "I'm watching you." My heart skipped a beat. It was the same message that had appeared at the scene of every victim so far, scribbled hastily on scraps of paper, left behind like a taunt. It was like the killer was playing a game with us, daring us to catch him. "Any prints?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "No, sir. Nothing." I cursed under my breath. No prints, no witnesses, no DNA. Nothing that could lead us to the bastard behind this. It was as if he wanted us to find these messages but made sure there was no trace of himself left behind. "Who was the last victim?" I asked, trying to keep my mind focused. Her name was Rachel Hall, early 20s, lived a few blocks from here. I glanced at the picture again. Rachel Hall had the same dark hair and pale skin as the others. She could have been anyone. My sister, my daughter, a friend. The realization hit me harder than I expected. These weren't just random victims. These were people. People I could have known. I rubbed my eyes and sighed. I needed to think. I needed to get a grip. That night, I went back to the office, staring at the case files spread out before me. The pattern was undeniable. 3 victims, all women, all with the same physical characteristics. But it wasn't just that. It was the way they died. The message left behind. The complete lack of evidence. The killer was playing a game, one that we were losing. I ran through the possibilities. Was there any connection between the victims? Were they connected to each other in some way? The answer was no. They had no criminal records, no history of involvement with dangerous people. They had no reason to be targeted. At least, not on the surface. But the deeper I dug, the more I began to see the cracks. The first victim, Jessica, had a sister who worked at a local bar. The second, Olivia, had a boyfriend who was rumored to have connections to the underground drug trade. And Rachel? Rachel had been known to frequent a strip club late at night, but no one knew exactly why. There were whispers, rumors, but no hard evidence. Maybe the victims had been chosen at random. Maybe they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe the killer was more methodical than we thought. But there was one thing that stuck with me. The message. "I'm watching you." That wasn't just a warning. It was an invitation. The killer wanted us to know he was out there. He wanted us to feel the weight of his gaze, the constant pressure of knowing he was somewhere, watching, waiting. And that made him dangerous. More dangerous than I could have imagined. Part 2. The Descent. The days passed in a blur. The case consumed me like a fire. I could feel it gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, tugging at the thread of my sanity, threatening to unravel everything I thought I knew. Each new piece of information I uncovered only deepened the mystery. I started seeing patterns in everything, subtle connections, hints, whispers in the dark. But the truth? The truth remained just out of reach, like a shadow you can't quite catch, no matter how fast you run. I spent hours in the office, going through every report, every piece of evidence. The killer wasn't just a shadow. He was someone who had been playing this game for a long time, a man who had learned how to hide in plain sight. He knew how to cover his tracks, how to leave no trace. And he was getting more brazen with each passing day. The third victim, Rachel Hall, had been found just as the others had. A similar pattern, no signs of struggle, no blood at the scene, just a body, abandoned like a discarded doll. But what set Rachel apart was the fact that she had been seen leaving the bar where her sister worked. The last person to speak to her had been a man, a regular, someone who came in nearly every night. His name was Thomas. He was quiet, unremarkable, a man who blended into the crowd. But now, he was the only lead we had. I made a decision then. I had to see Thomas. I had to get into his head, figure out if he knew more than he was letting on. I found him at his apartment building, sitting on the front steps, smoking a cigarette. He was older than I expected, with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. He looked like a man who had been worn down by life. But there was something in his posture, something in the way he held himself that told me he was hiding something. Something dark. "Thomas," I said, stepping up to him. He looked up, startled, but quickly composed himself. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice rough. "I need to ask you a few questions about Rachel Hall," I said, keeping my tone professional. "She was seen leaving the bar the night she disappeared. You were one of the last people to see her." His face hardened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to tell me to go to hell. But instead, he just flicked the cigarette away and stood up. "Come on inside," he said, gesturing toward the door. "I don't know what you're looking for, but I'll talk." Thomas's apartment was small, sparsely furnished. It smelled of stale beer and the faint scent of something old, something rotting in the corners. The walls were bare, save for a few framed photographs of him and friends, laughing, drinking, pretending to be happy. There was a sense of abandonment in the place, a feeling of stagnation. It was as if Thomas had been living in limbo, suspended between the life he once had and the one he'd somehow let slip away. We sat across from each other at a small table. I could tell he was nervous, his hands shaking slightly as he fiddled with the edges of his sleeves. But I didn't trust his nerves. I knew that look, the one that said someone was hiding more than they were letting on. "I don't know what you think you're going to find," Thomas said, his voice a little too calm. "I don't know Rachel like that. She came into the bar a few times. That's it." I studied his face, looking for any sign that he was lying. There was nothing overt, but the way he wouldn't look me in the eye, the way his fingers twitched, told me everything I needed to know. He was nervous. Too nervous. "Rachel's dead, Thomas," I said, leaning forward. "And I think you know more about it than you're letting on." His eyes flickered, a brief flash of panic before he regained control. "I told you, I don't know anything," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I didn't hurt her. I didn't even know her that well. She just came in. We talked. That was it." I stared at him, letting the silence stretch between us. Silence always made people uncomfortable, and in my experience, people would fill it with the truth, whether they meant to or not. "And what about the others?" I asked softly. "Do you know them too? The other victims? They all had connections to places like the bar, places like yours." Thomas froze. His eyes widened ever so slightly, his hand tightening around the edge of the table. For a moment, I thought he was going to break, to tell me everything. But instead, he clenched his jaw and looked away. "I don't know what you're talking about," he muttered. "I don't know anything about those other women." But I could see it now, the cracks in his facade, the guilt he was trying so hard to hide. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my expression neutral. He wasn't telling me everything. I knew that. And yet, I wasn't getting any closer to understanding the full picture. Before I could say anything else, Thomas stood up abruptly. "I've said all I'm going to say," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't know anything. I'm not involved." I didn't argue with him. There was no point. He was scared, of me, of what I might find out, or of what he had been part of. I had no proof to hold him, no solid evidence to arrest him. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas was hiding something, and I was going to find out what it was. One way or another. I left his apartment without saying another word. As I stepped out onto the street, I felt the weight of the city pressing in on me. It felt different now, as though I were walking through a world that was starting to shift, starting to unravel. The case had become more than just a job. It had become an obsession. I couldn't let it go. Not now. Not when I was so close to the truth. That night, I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation with Thomas in my head. Something didn't sit right with me. The pattern, the victims, the messages, they were all connected. But I was missing something. There was a piece of the puzzle that I hadn't seen yet. I reached for my phone, opened the file on the victims again, and started scrolling through the details. The more I read, the more the pieces seemed to fit together. Each victim had been connected to a place, a person, a night out, something that tied them to the bars, to the streets where Thomas lived. And then it hit me. What if Thomas wasn't the killer? What if he was just another victim? Someone else had been orchestrating this. Someone who had been watching, waiting, playing this game for a long time. Part 3. The web unravels. I couldn't shake the thought, couldn't ignore the pieces of the puzzle that were slowly, but surely, coming together. What if Thomas wasn't the killer? What if he was simply another pawn in a much larger game? I needed to look deeper. I needed to understand how everything was connected, how the victims, the bars, the locations, all of it tied back to something far more sinister than I had initially realized. I started reviewing every single detail, every small connection, every insignificant event. My desk became a mess of papers and notes, but it was the only way to think clearly, to see the patterns emerge from the chaos. I looked at the locations the victims had frequented, the clubs, the bars, the streets where they'd been seen last. And the more I dug into it, the more I realized how eerily similar each place was. They were all places of transition, bars where people came and went, streets where people walked alone, and clubs where the crowds were too big for anyone to notice the odd behavior. The first victim, Alicia Ford, had been seen leaving a bar in the city center late at night. She had been seen with a man, but there was no record of who that man was. The second victim, Emily Turner, had been at a different bar, but the details were almost identical. Both victims had interacted with someone, a man they didn't know, someone who disappeared into the crowd. I spent hours tracing the history of these bars and clubs, finding out who owned them, who worked there, and who frequented them. Then I stumbled upon a connection I hadn't anticipated. A single name kept cropping up, someone I hadn't seen in any of the initial reports. It was a man named Jack Myers. Jack Myers was listed as an occasional patron at almost every bar where a victim had been last seen. He wasn't just some random stranger who showed up. He was a fixture in these places. But there was no record of him being involved in any prior incidents, no criminal background, no obvious link to any of the victims, at least not until now. The more I looked into him, the more unsettling it became. He wasn't a frequent visitor to the bars, but his presence was enough to make an impact. And what struck me was the timing of his visits. He would always show up just before the victims disappeared. Every time, without fail. And when the victims were found, his name was nowhere to be found. I needed to know more about this Jack Myers, and I had to act fast. If there was one thing I knew, it was that time was running out. The killer, or whoever was pulling the strings, was growing bolder. I could feel it in my bones, the tension in the city, the sense of dread that was slowly taking hold of everyone. The next morning, I drove out to the first bar where Jack Myers had been seen. The bar was a dimly lit dive on the outskirts of town, a place where the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the hum of distant conversation. It wasn't much to look at, but it had been the last place where Alicia Ford had been spotted. I walked inside, scanning the room. The bartender, an older man with a graying beard, gave me a cursory glance before nodding in my direction. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gravelly from years of smoking. "I'm looking for someone," I said, my eyes scanning the dimly lit corners. Jack Myers. He was a regular here. The bartender stiffened. There was something in his eyes, something that said he knew exactly who I was talking about. He hesitated before answering. "Jack? He comes in now and then," he said. "Not much of a talker, but when he does, people notice. He's got this presence, you know?" I leaned in, trying to gauge his reaction. Did he know any of the victims? I asked, watching him carefully. The bartender's eyes flickered with unease, but he kept his composure. "I'm not sure. He talked to a lot of people, but he kept to himself mostly. If you're asking if he was involved in anything bad, I wouldn't know. He didn't come around after Alicia." I could feel the tension in the room grow. There was something the bartender wasn't telling me. I pressed him further. After Alicia? What do you mean? The bartender's expression shifted, and he looked around as though making sure no one else was listening. After she disappeared. Jack didn't show up for weeks after that. And then he came back, but it was different. I don't know how to explain it, but there was something off about him. That was all I needed to hear. There was more to Jack Myers than anyone was letting on, and I was going to find out what. Later that night, I managed to track down the last known address for Jack Myers, a rundown apartment on the edge of town. It was a quiet, nondescript building, one of those places where no one really paid attention to who lived there. I stood outside for a while, watching the windows, waiting for any sign of movement. And then, just as the sky began to darken, I saw him. Jack Myers walked into the building, his gait slow but purposeful. He didn't seem to notice me, didn't seem to be in a hurry, but something about his demeanor set my nerves on edge. There was an air of finality about him, like he was about to make a move he couldn't undo. I waited a few moments before following him inside. The building's hallway was silent, the walls thick with the scent of mildew and neglect. I could hear the faint sound of Jack's footsteps echoing down the corridor. I was close now, so close that I could almost feel the answers slipping through my fingers. I reached the door to his apartment and knocked. There was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sign of movement inside. But all I could hear was the faint sound of breathing. Slow, steady, almost as if he were waiting for me. I knocked once more, but this time, I didn't wait. I pushed the door open, my gun drawn, ready for whatever I would find. The apartment was empty, except for a single chair facing the wall. It was an old wooden chair, the kind you would see in a schoolroom. And sitting on the chair was a piece of paper, folded neatly, addressed to me. I didn't need to read the letter to know what it meant. The killer, or whoever was orchestrating this, had known I would come. He had been waiting for me. But this was only the beginning. There was so much more to uncover, and I was getting closer. Too close. Part 4, The Haunting Truth. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart hammering in my chest, staring at the letter that sat on the chair like a terrible omen. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and leave, to call for backup and bring the full force of the department to this place. But I couldn't. I had to know what was inside that letter. The chase had led me here, and I wasn't about to back down. With a shaky hand, I reached for the envelope, the weight of it far heavier than it should have been. As I unfolded the paper, a chill ran through me, almost as if the air itself had thickened. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, deliberate strokes, as though every word had been carefully crafted. "You're getting close, detective." My stomach twisted. The words weren't just a message, they were a challenge, a taunt. Whoever was behind this wasn't just playing a game. They were making me a part of it. "But it's not me you should be looking for." I froze. The words seemed to reach into my chest, wrapping around my heart and squeezing. I couldn't understand. This person had been behind everything. The murders, the disappearances. They'd made their moves from the shadows, pulling strings, creating chaos. How could they say it wasn't them? The one you seek has been with you all along. The game is just beginning, detective. My breath hitched, and the world seemed to spin. The words on the page blurred for a moment as I reread them, trying to piece together what they meant. Who could this mysterious figure be? Someone close to me? Someone I trusted? The sound of footsteps behind me shattered my thoughts, and I spun around instinctively, my hand reaching for my gun. But there was no one there. Just the empty hallway, the oppressive silence. I blinked, disoriented, and took a step backward, my back hitting the doorframe. The apartment felt suffocating now, as though the walls were closing in on me. I should have left. I should have gone back to the precinct and told them what I had found. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the edge of uncovering something monumental. Something that could change everything. The hallway was still quiet, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. There was a presence in the apartment now, a heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before. Every creak of the old building made my skin crawl, every movement a potential threat. I backed away from the door, making my way toward the living room. My eyes darted across the dimly lit space, scanning for anything out of place. Suddenly, a sound caught my attention, faint at first, but then unmistakable. A low, guttural noise coming from the back of the apartment. It was muffled, like something, or someone, was trying to be quiet, but the effort was failing. I followed the sound, each step slow and deliberate, as I moved toward the source. The apartment seemed unnervingly still, too still for comfort. As I approached the hallway leading to the bedroom, the noise grew louder, a strange, rhythmic scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across a hard surface. I stepped into the bedroom, my heart racing. The room was almost empty, save for a single figure hunched over in the far corner, obscured in shadow. I couldn't make out the details, but the shape was unmistakable. "Jack!" I called, my voice shaky but firm. There was no response. The figure remained still, unmoving, its presence somehow more menacing in the silence. I raised my gun, my grip tightening, ready to fire at the slightest sign of movement. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and then I saw it. The figure was scribbling something on the wall, the same deliberate, manic handwriting I had seen in the letter. I froze. This wasn't Jack. This was something else. The figure was writing something in thick, jagged letters, the words appearing on the wall like some grotesque form of communication. The figure continued to scrawl, oblivious to my presence. My hands shook as I stepped forward, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. What the hell was going on here? I reached out slowly, trying to get closer without alerting the figure. But then, something strange happened. The figure stopped. In an instant, it turned toward me, its eyes wide and bloodshot, a twisted smile spreading across its face. "Detective," it whispered, the voice gravelly and distant. "You've been looking in the wrong places. The answers were here all along." Before I could react, it lunged at me with terrifying speed. I fired instinctively, the gunshot ringing in the confined space, but the figure wasn't there anymore. It was as though it had disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the echo of its presence behind. The room was eerily quiet again, and I stood there, breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell had just happened? I didn't know how long I stood there, trying to make sense of everything. My mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, each one more impossible than the last. But one thing was clear now: the game was far from over. And the killer, or whatever this thing was far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. I stumbled out of the apartment, barely able to keep my footing as my mind spun with confusion. The letter, the figure, the strange events, all of it pointed to something bigger than a simple case of murder. The real threat was still out there, and I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered every last secret. That night, I couldn't sleep. The events of the day, the cryptic letter, the terrifying encounter, it all haunted me. I couldn't get the image of the figure out of my head. The way it smiled, the way it spoke, and most chilling of all, the words it had said. The answers were here all along. I knew I was missing something crucial. I had to go back to the beginning, back to where it all started, and this time, I couldn't afford to miss anything. The connection between the victims, the bars, and now this thing that wasn't Jack Myers. It was all tied together in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. I took another look at the letter. The words still echoed in my mind, over and over again. But something stood out to me, something I had missed before. "The one you seek has been with you all along." Who was the one? Who had been with me all along? And then it hit me. The figure. It wasn't Jack. It wasn't even human. It was something else entirely, something that had been hiding in plain sight. My blood ran cold as the answer came to me. It was me. The depths below. The dark tunnels stretched endlessly beneath the bustling streets of Paris, an uncharted labyrinth of forgotten bones and whispered secrets. To most people, the catacombs were a thing of legend, an eerie place for tourists to take brief glimpses, but never to stay too long. Few ever ventured deep into the maze of tunnels, and fewer still returned with anything resembling a coherent story. But for some, the darkness below was irresistible. Chapter 1. The Descent. Elliot had never been the adventurous type. An unremarkable man in his late 20s, he was more at home with a book in his hand than seeking out thrills. But one particular Friday night, when his friends, Jules, a thrill-seeker, and Marie, a photographer with a fascination for the macabre, came up with the idea of exploring the catacombs, Elliot found himself caught between his instinct for caution and the pull of something darker, more exciting. The catacombs had always intrigued him, even as a child. He'd read about them in books, seen the eerie photos of the stacked bones that seemed to stretch for miles. But it was more than curiosity. There was something in the air that night, a sensation that maybe, just maybe, the depths of the catacombs could answer questions he never even realized he had. As the sun set behind the iconic skyline of Paris, the three friends gathered at the entrance to the catacombs on Place Denfert Rochereau. The cold night air seemed to press against them, as if trying to stop them from entering. Marie led the way, a flashlight in her hand, her camera slung across her shoulder. Jules, ever the bold one, was already grinning like a madman, ready for the adventure. And Elliot, reluctantly but with a growing sense of unease, followed. The entrance was dark, a wide iron gate locked with a rusty chain. After a few minutes of fiddling, Jules managed to break the lock open with a crowbar. It wasn't a difficult task. There were stories of people sneaking into the catacombs all the time, but Elliot felt a twinge of discomfort in his stomach as the gate creaked open. A gust of stale air rushed out, bringing with it the scent of earth and decay. "Are we really doing this?" Elliot muttered, hesitating at the threshold. Jules gave him a look, half amused, half challenging. "Of course we are. You wanted adventure, right? No turning back now." Marie gave a nervous smile, though her excitement was palpable. "I've wanted to photograph this place for years. There's something beautiful about the history down here. The bones, the passageways." Her voice trailed off as she stepped into the darkness, followed by Jules. Elliot took a deep breath and, with one last look at the glowing lights of Paris behind him, followed them into the catacombs. The temperature dropped immediately, the walls of the tunnels cold and damp against the air. The only sounds were the soft echoes of their footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the walls. Marie's flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the piles of bones, stacked meticulously along the walls in geometric patterns. They seemed endless, rows upon rows of skulls and femurs, stretching into the abyss. The deeper they went, the more the silence pressed in on them, suffocating and oppressive. Elliot tried to push aside the creeping sense of dread that slowly gnawed at his mind, but it was difficult. The catacombs were a graveyard, after all, not just for the bones of the dead, but for the memories of those who had wandered into these depths and never returned. "It's amazing," Marie whispered, snapping pictures of the eerie arrangements of bones. "There's so much history down here. So much life, in a strange way." Elliot nodded, though his unease only grew as they ventured further. Something about the silence of the place, the unnatural stillness, felt wrong. Jules was the first to break the quiet. "Hey, did you hear that?" Elliot stopped, his heart racing. "Hear what?" "Footsteps," Jules said, his voice lower now. "Behind us." Elliot turned, but the tunnel was empty behind them. Only the distant glow of Marie's flashlight illuminated the endless passageways. "There's no one else down here," he said, trying to dismiss the growing anxiety in his voice. Jules shrugged. "I don't know. It sounded like someone was following us. Anyway, let's keep going." But as they moved deeper, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The silence seemed too complete, too unnatural. He glanced over at Marie, who was now focusing intently on her camera, oblivious to the growing tension. Minutes turned to hours, and still, they descended. The catacombs seemed to go on forever, a never-ending maze of bones, tunnels, and forgotten rooms. At one point, they reached a narrow, claustrophobic passageway, where the walls were so close that they had to crawl on hands and knees. "I don't know, guys," Elliot said, his voice tight. "This is getting too deep. We should turn back." But Jules and Marie urged him on. "We're fine," Jules insisted, though there was a nervous edge to his tone now. "We're close to something." "I don't know," Marie echoed. "I can feel it. There's something down here. I want to see it." Despite his growing sense of dread, Elliot followed them, unable to ignore the pull of their excitement. They pushed through the cramped passageway, deeper into the bowels of the catacombs, until they came to a large, circular chamber. The air here felt different, heavier. The smell of rot was stronger, and the walls were lined with intricate carvings, depicting strange symbols that Elliot couldn't recognize. At the center of the room was a stone pedestal, and on it, something that made his blood run cold. It was a large, ancient-looking book, its pages yellowed with age, its leather cover cracked and worn. It looked out of place, almost like it had been left there for someone to find. "What is that?" Marie whispered, stepping forward to examine the book. Before anyone could answer, a low, guttural sound echoed through the chamber, like something large shifting in the shadows. Elliot froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in around them. The sound grew louder, closer. Someone, was in the room with them. Jules turned to face the darkness, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. And then, from the blackness, something stepped into the light. It was a figure, humanoid but wrong, its body twisted and contorted, moving with an unnatural, jerky motion. The face was a mass of shifting shadows, as if it couldn't decide on a form. Eyes flickered in and out of existence, and its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. Marie gasped, stepping back, but her legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the stone floor. Jules reached for his phone, but as he fumbled with the device, the creature lunged forward, its mouth snapping open wide. Before Elliot could react, it was on them. Chapter 2. The descent continues. The creature's movements were inhuman, a blur of jerky, erratic motions. Its form flickered like a dying light bulb, parts of its body seeming to shift in and out of focus. The air grew thick with a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to crush Elliot's chest. Time slowed down, each second stretching longer than the last. Elliot's breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to back away, but his feet felt glued to the cold stone floor. He reached for Marie, but she was too far, her eyes wide with terror as she scrambled backward. Jules, to his credit, tried to take action. He lunged forward, flashlight held high, and swung it toward the creature. But the light flickered out, leaving only darkness. "Run!" Jules shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. But there was no room to run. The chamber, with its oppressive walls and the stone pedestal at its center, felt like a trap. Elliot's pulse pounded in his ears, his limbs frozen with fear. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The creature, or whatever it was, turned toward Jules. Its face, the shifting, amorphous face, stretched wide, as if to smile, its teeth gleaming in the flickering light. It was no longer just a figure. It was a presence, an overwhelming weight that seemed to fill the space around them. Elliot finally managed to move, a cold, numbing instinct forcing him to act. His body screamed for him to run, but his legs felt heavy, as though wading through deep water. He grabbed Marie by the arm and pulled her toward the nearest exit, the narrow passageway they had come through. But the path seemed even longer now, the walls closing in on them. The creature's footsteps echoed behind them, unnatural and slow, like it was savoring every moment of their panic. Marie stumbled, falling to the floor with a cry. Elliot turned back for her, but when he reached down to help her up, a chilling sensation filled the air. His fingers brushed against something, cold and wet, like skin. But it wasn't her. He looked up. The creature was there, standing in the passageway, its shifting form filling the entire space. Its face was now fully visible, if only for a moment, an indistinct blur, as if it had no true shape, no true identity. But its eyes, those eyes burned with a terrible, consuming hunger. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature lunged. Chapter 3. Into the Abyss. Elliot and Marie barely had time to react. With a cry, Elliot shoved Marie toward the opening of the passageway, narrowly avoiding the creature's grasp. It moved within human speed, faster than any human could comprehend. The walls of the catacombs seemed to pulse, as though alive, closing in around them. The very air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Jules was already running, his voice echoing through the tunnel ahead. "Hurry! It's right behind us!" Elliot and Marie followed, the sound of their footsteps reverberating against the stone walls. The tunnel stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning, offering no escape. There was no way out. Elliot's breath came in ragged gasps as he pushed himself harder, willing his legs to move faster, but it was no use. The creature's presence was everywhere, like a shadow at the edge of his vision. He could feel it, closing in, stalking them through the maze of tunnels. Marie stumbled, gasping for air. It's getting closer." Elliot reached out, grabbing her arm to pull her along, but just as he did, a bone-chilling scream echoed from somewhere deep within the catacombs. It wasn't Jules. It was something else, something more terrible. The sound was distorted, as if the very walls were screaming, reverberating with an unnatural frequency. "We can't outrun it," Elliot muttered, fear creeping into his voice. "We have to find another way out." Marie's eyes were wide with terror, but she nodded. "There's a side passage up ahead," she said breathlessly, pointing to the left. "I think it leads to an old exit." Elliot didn't hesitate. With every ounce of strength he had left, he pulled Marie toward the side passage, hoping against all reason that they would find salvation there. They dashed down the narrow corridor, the walls closing in as the sound of the creature's footsteps grew louder, closer. But the passage was not as it seemed. Chapter 4: The True Horror. The tunnel, which had once seemed like their only hope, soon became a labyrinth of twisting, distorted corridors. The walls seemed to shift, the floor uneven beneath their feet. The air grew colder, and the darkness seemed to deepen with every step they took. "I don't understand," Marie said, her voice trembling. "This isn't right. This isn't the way out." Elliot's heart sank. He had been so sure that this was the way, the path that would lead them to safety. But now, it felt like they were being led deeper into the heart of the catacombs, farther from the world above. The creature's presence lingered, just out of sight but always there, like an animal stalking its prey. Then, as they rounded another corner, they saw it. A figure stood in the center of the passageway, blocking their way. It was tall, thin, and humanoid, draped in tattered rags that hung from its body like a shroud. Its face was hidden, but its presence was undeniable. The air around it seemed to hum, a low, vibrating sound that filled the entire tunnel. Who are you?" Elliot asked, his voice hoarse. The figure did not respond. Instead, it stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. As it did, the ground beneath them began to tremble, as if the very catacombs were alive. Marie gasped, backing away, but Elliot stood frozen in place, staring at the figure. The darkness around them seemed to deepen, the walls shifting as if they were alive. There was something terrifyingly wrong about the figure, something ancient and evil. And then, without warning, the figure raised its arm, pointing directly at them. In that instant, the ground beneath them gave way. Chapter 5: The Final Descent. Elliot and Marie fell, the world spinning as they plummeted into darkness. Their screams were drowned out by the deafening sound of the earth shifting beneath them. When they landed, the impact knocked the breath from their lungs. They were no longer in the tunnels. No, they had fallen into something far worse. The chamber was vast, its walls lined with symbols and carvings that made no sense. The air was thick with the stench of decay, but this place was different. It was ancient. The darkness was alive, breathing, pressing in on them from all sides. And standing in the center of the room, the figure from the tunnels watched them with empty, hollow eyes. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to stand, but his body refused to cooperate. The creature was there, just beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. Its form flickered, always shifting, never stable. "It's over," Elliot whispered, his voice breaking. "We're trapped." Marie, too, seemed to realize the horror of their situation. "We were never meant to escape," she said, her voice distant, hollow. As the figure approached, the room began to darken even further, the shadows seeming to warp and twist around them. The air grew thick with a sense of finality. There was nowhere to run, no escape. And then, with one final motion, the darkness consumed them. Chapter 6. The Endless Night. Elliot's body felt weightless as the darkness pressed against him, suffocating every thought, every breath. The sense of finality, the certainty that this was the end, sank deep into his bones. There was no more air, no more light, no more escape. Only the oppressive weight of something ancient and unfathomable closing in. He tried to move, tried to scream, but his body was paralyzed, trapped in the void. Time seemed to stretch into infinity, like he was caught in the embrace of a nightmare from which there was no waking. His mind screamed in desperation, but there was no answer, only silence. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, the suffocating pressure released. Elliot gasped, sucking in the cool, stale air, his eyes snapping open. The world around him was still pitch black, but there was a strange, unnatural stillness to it. He wasn't sure if he was awake, but the feeling in his chest told him that he was. Something had changed. Something was wrong. He slowly pushed himself to his knees, the sharp stone of the ground biting into his skin. His hands trembled as he wiped away the sweat on his brow, only to find that it wasn't sweat at all. The skin of his face felt different, unnaturally slick and cold. When he tried to call out, his voice cracked, a hollow, unnatural sound that echoed strangely in the silence. He reached for Marie, but when his fingers brushed her arm, she didn't respond. Her body was unnaturally stiff, as though she were frozen in place. "Marie, Marie, wake up!" Elliot whispered frantically, shaking her, but there was no response. His panic grew. What was happening? Why were they here, trapped in this place? Suddenly, he felt something stir in the shadows, movement, but not from Marie. The air grew thick once again, and Elliot's breath caught in his throat as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was the same figure they had seen before, the one that had led them into the depths of the catacombs, the one that had trapped them here. It moved toward him with deliberate slowness, its steps echoing in the unnatural silence. Each step sounded like it came from the very bowels of the earth, heavy and ominous. The figure's shape was still shrouded, but Elliot could feel its gaze upon him, pressing into his very soul. "Why are you doing this?" Elliot asked, his voice weak. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out a hand, an impossibly long, skeletal hand, and placed it on his forehead. The touch was cold, colder than anything Elliot had ever felt before. He recoiled, but the figure's grip tightened, holding him in place. Elliot's vision blurred as a strange sensation filled his mind. The walls of the catacombs around him seemed to warp and shift, like a living, breathing thing. The sounds of distant whispers filled his ears, voices, hundreds of them, speaking in an alien language that he couldn't comprehend. And then, with a final jolt, something cracked within him. The world around him exploded into brilliant, blinding light. Chapter 7. The Truth Revealed. Elliot stumbled back, his heart racing, his mind reeling. He was no longer in the catacombs. No, he was somewhere else, somewhere vast and alien, a place that felt both familiar and utterly foreign. The light that surrounded him wasn't natural, but it was warm, filling him with an unnatural sense of calm. He looked around, trying to make sense of his surroundings, but everything was shifting. The space around him was constantly changing, stretching, twisting, as if the very fabric of reality was warping. He couldn't focus on anything for long. Everything slipped away the moment he tried to understand it. And then, in the center of this distorted reality, stood Marie. She was standing motionless, her body rigid, her eyes wide open but unseeing. The same unsettling stillness that had gripped her before now took hold of her completely. She didn't move, didn't react to his presence, as if she were completely disconnected from the world. "Marie!" Elliot called softly, his voice hoarse, but she didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Then, the creature, No, the figure appeared before him again, its shadow stretching across the warped landscape. It was taller now, looming over Elliot, its form growing more defined. The creature's face, if it could even be called that, was clearer now. It was the face of 1,000 shifting faces, none of them permanent. Its eyes gleamed with an otherworldly hunger, and its mouth, stretching impossibly wide, was filled with countless rows of jagged teeth. "You've entered my domain," the figure said, its voice both distant and intimate, reverberating through the strange space. Elliot felt a chill run through him, his legs shaking beneath him as the full weight of the creature's presence pressed down on him. "What do you want from us?" Elliot managed to whisper, his voice cracking with terror. The figure tilted its head slightly, as though considering his question. Then it spoke again, its words heavy with meaning, each syllable sending a ripple through the very fabric of this strange world. "You were always meant to find this place. All of you," it said, its voice growing darker, deeper. "You are part of a greater cycle. You are not the first to come, and you will not be the last." Elliot's mind spun. The words made no sense, but they felt true in a way that terrified him. "What, cycle? What do you mean?" The figure took a step closer, and with each movement, the air around them seemed to thicken. "You are intruders, but you were never meant to leave. Your curiosity, your need to explore, it's all part of the pattern." Elliot's heart hammered in his chest. "Pattern? But we just wanted to find something. We didn't mean any harm." The creature's eyes glowed with a terrible, ancient wisdom. "Your desire to understand, to uncover the unknown, is what binds you to this place. And now, you will be part of the darkness, just as those before you." "No," Elliot whispered, his breath catching in his throat. "Please." The figure smiled, but it wasn't a smile that brought comfort. It was cold, empty, and filled with malice. "There is no escape, Elliot. There never was." And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the world around him began to crumble. The distorted landscape shattered like glass, falling into an abyss that seemed to stretch endlessly. The figure, still smiling, began to fade, its form dissipating into the nothingness. Marie, still frozen, was swallowed by the darkness, and Elliot felt himself being pulled along with her. In that moment, as the darkness consumed him, the truth of the catacombs, the truth of this place, became clear. They were never meant to leave, and they never would. When Sarah moved into the old house on Blackwood Lane, she had no idea how much it would change her. The house had been vacant for over a decade. The neighbors claimed it had been abandoned due to strange occurrences, but Sarah, fresh from a breakup and desperate for a new start, saw only an opportunity. The price was unbelievably low for the size, and she was ready to escape from her old life. The house was large, with high ceilings and narrow hallways, and despite the years of disrepair, it had a strange charm about it. Sarah began unpacking her boxes on the first day, the silence of the house almost deafening in its emptiness. There was no laughter, no voices, no familiar noises of life. It felt wrong, but she brushed it off. She had never been one to believe in superstitions or rumors. Her first night was quiet, too quiet. There were no creaks of the floorboards or the usual sounds of an old house settling into the night. Just stillness. As Sarah tried to sleep, she found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, the quiet pressing down on her like a physical weight. Eventually, she drifted off, but it wasn't a restful sleep. Her dreams were disturbed by flashes of images, shadows moving through her room, whispers in the darkness. The next morning, Sarah shook off the unease and went about her day, but as the sun began to set, the house seemed to change. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. She couldn't put her finger on it, but there was a sense that something watched her. That night, she heard the first sound. It was faint at first, like a whisper, so soft she thought she had imagined it. But then it came again, closer this time, faint murmurs, like voices on the edge of hearing. They seemed to come from the hallway outside her room, or maybe from within the walls themselves. Sarah held her breath, trying to listen, but it stopped as suddenly as it had started. She waited in the silence, her heart pounding in her chest. The stillness that followed was oppressive. Slowly, she convinced herself it was nothing. Perhaps the house settling. Perhaps her mind playing tricks on her. She tried to go back to sleep. The next day, Sarah decided to explore the house, to get to know it better. She wandered from room to room, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the creaky wooden floors, the dust that had settled over everything. As she explored the back hallway, she found a door at the end, one she hadn't noticed before. It was small, almost hidden, and it seemed to lead down into a basement. A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she reached for the door handle. Something about it felt wrong. Her hand hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of her. She turned the knob, and the door creaked open to reveal a staircase leading down into darkness. The basement was cold, the air thick with must and dampness. Sarah flicked on the light switch, but nothing happened. She fumbled for her phone, using the flashlight to illuminate the steps in front of her. As she descended, the silence grew thicker, and the walls seemed to close in around her. The stairs creaked under her weight, each step echoing in the quiet. At the bottom of the stairs, she found an old wooden door, cracked and weathered. It was slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, she felt a rush of stale, cold air. Inside, there were boxes and old furniture covered in dust, but what caught her attention was the large mirror on the far wall. It was framed in dark wood, ornate and out of place in the otherwise forgotten space. She stepped closer, feeling a strange pull toward it, as if the mirror was calling to her. As she gazed into it, she expected to see her own reflection, but instead, she saw something different. A shadow, dark and indistinct, loomed behind her in the reflection, though there was nothing there in reality. She blinked, rubbing her eyes, but when she looked again, it was gone. Shaken, she quickly turned away from the mirror and began to leave the basement. But as she turned to climb the stairs, she heard something, a whisper, so faint it was almost imperceptible. She froze. "Sarah," the voice seemed to say. Her heart stopped. She glanced back at the basement, but the mirror was empty now, reflecting only the dusty room. Had she imagined it? She quickly hurried up the stairs and slammed the door behind her, locking it tightly. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences continued. The whispers came more frequently, always just out of reach, like someone standing behind her, breathing down her neck. And always, there was that same feeling of being watched. But it wasn't until the third night that things took a darker turn. Sarah had been lying in bed, trying to sleep, when she heard the sound again, louder this time. A slow, deliberate tapping, coming from the hallway. Tap, tap, tap. It echoed through the quiet house, sending a chill down her spine. She sat up in bed, her breath shallow, waiting for the sound to stop, but it didn't. It continued, coming closer, as if something, or someone, was walking down the hallway toward her. Frozen with fear, she didn't dare move. Her mind raced, searching for a logical explanation. It had to be the house, the wind, or maybe just her imagination running wild. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The tapping grew louder, more distinct, until it was right outside her door. Then, it stopped. The silence was deafening. She held her breath, too terrified to even move, and waited. What was out there? What was waiting for her? She strained her ears, hoping to hear anything, just the slightest sound to tell her she wasn't alone. But there was nothing. The silence stretched on, unbearable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah summoned the courage to get up. Slowly, she approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She opened it, cautiously peering into the dark hallway. There was nothing. The hallway was empty, just as it had been when she went to bed. Her heart began to slow, and she let out a shaky breath. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe she had just imagined it. But as she turned to close the door, she saw something on the floor. A footprint. Fresh, as if someone, or something, had been standing right outside her room. She slammed the door shut, her mind racing, her breath quickening. This wasn't just imagination. Something was in the house with her. Something she couldn't see but could feel. Something that wanted her. The next few days were a blur of fear and sleepless nights. Sarah tried to convince herself she was just being paranoid. The house was old. Of course, it creaked. Of course, there were strange noises. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The whispers continued, growing louder each day. And the figure in the mirror, the one she had seen in the basement, began to appear again. This time not just in the basement, but in every reflection she passed. Always watching. One night, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She had to leave. She had to get out of the house. But as she packed her things, something stopped her. The mirror. She found herself drawn to it, just as she had in the basement. But this time, the reflection wasn't just a shadow. It was a face. A pale, gaunt face, with hollow eyes that stared right at her. The lips stretched into a twisted grin, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. And then, the face in the mirror spoke. "Leave now, or stay forever." It was then that she realized the truth. The house, the mirror, the whispers, they weren't just random occurrences. They were part of something darker, something that had been waiting for her. But when she turned to run, the door to the room slammed shut, trapping her inside. The house wasn't letting her go. Not now. Sarah stood frozen in the center of the room, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away. The door had slammed shut behind her with a force that rattled the walls, trapping her in this nightmare. The reflection in the mirror was gone now, replaced by only her own trembling form. But she could still feel those eyes on her, the hollow, empty gaze of something far worse than mere darkness. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, pressing down on her chest as though the very walls were suffocating her. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, and she backed away from the mirror, every fiber of her being screaming to leave the room, to escape the suffocating grip of the house. But as she turned to the door, she realized with growing dread that the doorknob wasn't turning. It was stuck, immovable, as though something on the other side was holding it shut. She yanked at the door again, panic rising in her throat, but it wouldn't budge. She banged her fists against the wood, shouting for help, though she knew it was hopeless. There was no one here. No one but her and whatever was waiting for her. The whispers came again, this time more insistent, as if the very walls were speaking to her. "Sarah. Sarah," the voice was distant, almost a lullaby, but it wasn't comforting. It was maddening. A cold draft blew through the room, making her shiver uncontrollably. She spun around, searching for the source of the wind, but the window was closed. There was no breeze. Yet the chill remained, creeping into her bones. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure. At first, it was just a shadow, a distortion in the air. But as she turned toward it, it became clearer. A tall, gaunt shape with no discernible features, just darkness that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its presence felt oppressive, like it was pressing in from all sides, closing in on her. Her heart raced, and her mouth went dry. She took a step back, her legs shaking beneath her. She knew she had to get out of this room, away from whatever that thing was, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. All she could do was stare at the figure, frozen in place by sheer terror. The whispers were growing louder now, merging into a cacophony of voices, all speaking her name. "Sarah, Sarah, Sarah." They seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding her, closing in. And then, in a voice that cut through the others, the same voice from the mirror spoke again. But this time it was clearer, louder, more commanding. "You can't leave." The words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over, as though they were carved into her thoughts. Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears, and she felt her stomach churn with fear. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, her back pressed against the cold wall. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to make sense of what was happening. It felt like the walls themselves were alive, shifting, bending around her. The figure in the corner seemed to move, inching closer with each passing second. It had no face, no features at all, just a dark shape that seemed to grow taller as it approached. The air around it grew colder, and Sarah could feel the temperature drop rapidly, her breath forming visible clouds in the space between them. It stopped just in front of her, its presence so overwhelming that Sarah felt as though the very essence of her being was being pulled into it. She could feel something, a pressure, a weight pressing down on her chest. It was as if the thing in front of her wasn't just standing there. It was feeding on her fear, growing stronger with every passing second. "Why are you here?" she managed to choke out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached out, its hands, if they could even be called that, stretching toward her with unnatural length. They were like tendrils, long and twisted, reaching out for her with an unrelenting hunger. Fear surged within her, and she scrambled backward, her hands desperately searching for any way to escape. Her fingers brushed against the mirror again, the cold surface of it. She recoiled, horrified. The whispers surged in volume, reaching a deafening crescendo. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse with panic. "No, please. I need to leave." But the figure didn't stop. It reached her, its hands closing in around her, and she felt the chill of its touch seep into her skin. It was ice cold, like the void itself, and it felt as though her very soul was being drained by the contact. Her heart raced, her body shaking, but she couldn't pull away. Her legs had become useless, unable to move. Suddenly, there was a sharp, jarring noise, a creaking sound, almost like a door opening. But the figure didn't flinch. It remained there, hovering over her, its tendrils inching closer, tightening around her. And then, just as abruptly, it stopped. The coldness, the pressure, the whispers, they all faded, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Sarah blinked, disoriented, still trembling, but she couldn't tell if she was still in the same room or if she had been transported somewhere else entirely. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around her. But then she realized with a jolt that the figure wasn't gone. It was still there, only now, it was no longer a shadow in the corner. It was in front of her, standing tall, its face finally visible. But the face, it wasn't human. It was a grotesque mockery of a face, twisted and broken, its features contorted in a grotesque grin. "Leave," it whispered, its voice now a guttural hiss. Suddenly, Sarah felt the ground beneath her feet shift. The walls seemed to warp and buckle, the room bending in impossible ways. The mirror, still there, reflected something different this time. It wasn't Sarah's image. It wasn't even the dark figure. It was nothing. The mirror reflected a void, a vast emptiness that stretched on forever. And then, Sarah understood. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. It was feeding off her fear, pulling her deeper into its grip with every passing second. She wasn't going to escape. The whispers returned, louder now, filled with promises and threats. "Stay forever," they urged. "Join us." But Sarah didn't hear them anymore. She was no longer listening. She had no choice but to give in. There was no way out. The mirror's emptiness called to her, and as she reached out for it, she felt herself being pulled in, her body bending in impossible ways as the darkness swallowed her whole. And the house? It was waiting for the next victim. The end of one tale often heralds the beginning of another. Within the quiet corners of the mundane, darkness waits patiently, unseen yet omnipresent, like a shadow at the edge of your vision. This is where our story begins, where the familiar twists into the grotesque, and the ordinary hides a malevolent secret. The house on Winter's Hill was more of an eyesore than a landmark. Its tilted roof sagged like a weary sigh, and its peeling grey paint revealed the raw, weathered boards beneath. For years, it had been a topic of fascination among the townsfolk, who shared whispered rumors about its strange passed-over coffee at the diner. A murder-suicide, some claimed. Others swore it had been the site of a cult ritual gone wrong. And then there were the few, always speaking in hushed tones, who said the house was simply wrong. Not cursed, not haunted, but a living, breathing entity that devoured those foolish enough to step inside. Elliot Fairweather had heard all the stories. But as he stood before the house now, with its gaping front door hanging ajar like a toothless mouth, none of them seemed particularly important. What mattered was that the house was his ticket out of poverty. At 33, Elliot's life was a string of near misses and bad luck. An aspiring writer, he'd never managed to get anything published beyond the occasional short story in obscure online magazines. His bank account was a joke, his apartment barely livable, and his landlord had recently started leaving eviction notices taped to his door. So when the letter came, a formal invitation to spend a month in the house on Winters Hill, with a $50,000 payout for documenting his experience, he didn't hesitate. Sure, it reeked of desperation, but he wasn't in a position to care. 50 grand was a fortune, and all he had to do was write about some creepy old house. Elliot arrived just before dusk, the dying sunlight casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. He parked his rusted sedan at the edge of the driveway and pulled his suitcase from the trunk. The letter had been clear: bring enough supplies for a month and come alone. The inside of the house was as dismal as its exterior. The floorboards creaked with every step, and the wallpaper was yellowed and peeling. Dust hung in the air, visible in the weak light streaming through the cracked windows. Elliot set his suitcase down in what appeared to be the living room. A single armchair sat in the corner, its fabric moth-eaten and stained. Beside it, a small table held an antique lamp, its bulb flickering weakly when he turned it on. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of birds outside. Elliot unpacked quickly, trying to shake the feeling that he was being watched. By the time night fell, he had settled into one of the upstairs bedrooms. It was the least disgusting room he could find, with a relatively clean mattress and an actual lock on the door. He sat at the small desk by the window, his laptop open and ready. His first entry was straightforward. Day 1. The house is every bit as creepy as I expected. It smells like mold, and the floor feels like it might cave in under my weight. But it's quiet, too quiet. No footsteps, no whispers, just silence. Maybe this will be easier than I thought. As he typed, a faint sound caught his attention, a soft, rhythmic tapping. He paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound stopped. He turned his head, scanning the room. Nothing. With a shrug, he continued typing. The stories about this place are ridiculous. I don't feel anything here except boredom. Maybe this will make for a dull story after all. The tapping resumed, louder this time. It was coming from the wall behind him. Elliot stood slowly, his heart pounding. He approached the wall and pressed his ear against it. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, a whisper, so faint he almost missed it. Get out. Elliot staggered back from the wall, his breath caught in his throat. He told himself it must have been the wind, a draft through the old house creating some kind of auditory illusion. But the weight of the words, faint though they were, lingered like a shiver down his spine. Get it together, he muttered to himself, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow in the empty room. He returned to his desk and tried to focus on his writing, but the whispers had unsettled him. The night dragged on. Every creak of the floorboards and sigh of the wind outside made his nerves jump. By the time midnight rolled around, Elliot had given up on working and decided to sleep. The bed was lumpy, the springs digging into his back, and the blankets smelled faintly of mildew. He lay awake for what felt like hours, staring at the cracked ceiling. And then he heard it again. The tapping. This time, it wasn't coming from the wall. It was at the door. Elliot sat up, his chest tight with fear. The sound was soft but deliberate, a slow, steady knock. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. The tapping stopped. He grabbed his phone from the nightstand and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the door. The beam of light revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just the peeling paint and tarnished brass handle. With a deep breath, he swung his legs out of bed and stood. The wooden floor was icy beneath his feet as he approached the door. His hand hesitated on the knob before he twisted it open. The hallway was empty. He stepped out, shining his flashlight around. The air felt colder here, heavy with an unplaceable smell, something metallic and sour. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist as he moved, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. "Hello?" he called again, louder this time. No answer. He was about to retreat to his room when he noticed something strange. At the far end of the hallway, where the dim light didn't quite reach, there was a faint shape on the floor. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his ears. The shape resolved into a single, muddy footprint. It was too large to be his own. Elliot backed away, his flashlight flickering as if on cue. His breathing quickened as he turned and stumbled back to his room, slamming the door shut behind him. He locked it and leaned against the door, clutching the phone to his chest. This wasn't just his imagination. Someone else was in the house. He called the number on the letter, the one that had invited him here. It rang twice before a smooth, almost mechanical voice answered. "This is the Winters Hill Project. How can we assist you, Mr. Fairweather?" "There's someone in the house," Elliot said, his words tumbling over each other. "I heard tapping, and there's a footprint in the hallway. I think." "Remain calm," the voice interrupted. "The house is old. Strange noises are to be expected. As for the footprint, it's likely yours. The mind can play tricks in stressful environments. It's not mine," he snapped. "It's bigger than my foot, and it's fresh." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a faint clicking sound. "Noted. We'll send someone to investigate in the morning. In the meantime, we recommend staying in your room. Lock the door and try to get some sleep." The line went dead. Elliot stared at his phone in disbelief. He wanted to leave, wanted to grab his things and run out of this nightmare of a house. But the money. He needed the money. Resigning himself to the situation, he crawled back into bed, his flashlight clutched tightly in one hand. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the sound of creaking floorboards and distant whispers. By the time the pale light of dawn filtered through the window, he was more exhausted than rested. Downstairs, he found no sign of anyone, no fresh footprints, no muddy trail. It was as if the night before had been a hallucination. Determined to prove he wasn't losing his mind, Elliot decided to explore the house in daylight. Armed with his phone and a makeshift weapon, a rusty fire poker he found in the living room, he began his search. The first floor was as decrepit as he remembered. The kitchen was a graveyard of outdated appliances, the dining room covered in a fine layer of dust. But when he opened the door to the basement, he hesitated. The stairs descended into darkness, the smell of damp and rot wafting up to greet him. He almost turned back, but a flicker of movement at the bottom caught his eye. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing down the staircase. There was no response, but the faint sound of breathing reached his ears. Elliot gripped the fire poker tighter, his knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to bolt out of the house and never return. But his pride and curiosity held him rooted to the spot. With each creaking step downward, the air grew colder and heavier, the dampness clinging to his skin. The flashlight from his phone illuminated the narrow staircase, revealing crumbling brick walls streaked with something dark and wet. The breathing grew louder, echoing off the walls. It was shallow and ragged, almost human. At the bottom of the stairs, the beam of his flashlight caught a figure crouched in the corner, its back turned to him. "Hey!" he called, his voice cracking. "Who's they?" The figure didn't move. Summoning his courage, Elliot stepped closer. His flashlight revealed a man in tattered clothing, his body hunched unnaturally, like a broken marionette. "Are you okay?" Elliot asked, his voice trembling. The man turned slowly, his movements jerky and unnatural. His face, what remained of it, was a grotesque mask of decay, the skin sloughing off in patches to reveal sinew and bone. Clouded eyes locked onto Elliot, and the creature let out a guttural growl. Elliot stumbled back, his flashlight shaking wildly. The man, or whatever it was, lunged at him with inhuman speed. He swung the fire poker blindly, the metal colliding with a sickening crunch. The creature fell back, but only for a moment. It rose again, its broken limbs twisting unnaturally as it advanced. Panic surged through Elliot as he scrambled back up the stairs, the creature's growls and the sound of its claws scraping against the walls echoing behind him. He burst into the daylight of the living room, slamming the basement door shut and shoving a chair under the handle. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. The house was supposed to be empty. No one had lived here for decades. So what was that thing? His thoughts were interrupted by a faint tapping sound. Not from the basement this time, but from the front door. Elliot froze. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. "Who is it?" he shouted, his voice shaking. The tapping stopped. Slowly, he approached the door, gripping the fire poker tightly. He peeked through the peephole but saw nothing. Then the tapping began again, this time from the windows. Elliot's heart pounded as he turned to face the living room. Shadows flitted across the curtains, moving too quickly to be human. The whispers returned, surrounding him, growing louder until they were a deafening cacophony. "Get out!" they screamed in unison. Elliot didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his bag and bolted for the front door, yanking it open. The sunlight blinded him as he stumbled onto the overgrown lawn. The whispers faded, and the tapping ceased. For a brief moment, he felt relief. Then he turned back toward the house and froze. In every window, faces stared out at him, pale, hollow-eyed, and grinning. Elliot staggered back, his breath caught in his throat. The faces pressed against the windows of the decrepit house were impossibly still, yet their grins widened as if mocking his terror. His trembling hands dropped the fire poker, the clatter lost in the pounding of his heart. He forced his feet to move, stumbling down the gravel path toward his car. The keys felt like lead in his pocket as he fumbled them out, his fingers refusing to cooperate. The faces remained, unblinking, watching his every move. When he finally managed to unlock the car and slide inside, the oppressive silence was shattered by a deafening roar. The engine refused to turn over, sputtering violently before dying completely. Elliot pounded the steering wheel. "Come on, damn it!" A sharp knock on the driver's side window made him jump. His head whipped around, expecting one of those grinning faces. Instead, he saw darkness, pure and impenetrable. The knocking came again, rhythmic and deliberate. But there was no one there. Something was wrong with the light. The sun had been shining only moments ago, but now an unnatural dusk cloaked the area. Shadows stretched long and thin, as if they were alive, creeping toward the car. Elliot locked the doors, though a part of him knew it wouldn't matter. The shadows reached the vehicle, their movement slow but deliberate. They slithered up the tires, wrapping around the frame like grasping fingers. As the darkness consumed the car, Elliot's breath came in shallow gasps. Then, silence. The world outside was gone. No trees, no house, no sky. Just endless blackness. He heard it then. A soft, rasping voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You were warned." Elliot's scream was cut short as the driver's side door wrenched open. A hand, skeletal and impossibly strong, yanked him out. He hit the ground hard, his head swimming from the impact. As he struggled to his feet, he realized he was no longer near the house. The overgrown lawn and gravel path were gone, replaced by a barren landscape shrouded in mist. Figures emerged from the fog, their forms indistinct at first but growing clearer as they approached. They were the faces from the windows, now fully corporeal and even more grotesque. Their grins were too wide, splitting their faces unnaturally. Their hollow eyes seemed to burn with an inner light, and their hands twitched eagerly, as if anticipating something. "You came to the wrong place," one of them said, its voice a wet gurgle. Elliot backed away, but the figures closed in, their movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring his fear. "I didn't mean to," he stammered. "Meaning doesn't matter," another interrupted, its grin widening impossibly. "You stepped into what you didn't understand." The air grew colder, each breath burning his lungs. Elliot's mind raced, searching for a way out. The shadows danced around him, teasing him with glimpses of safety before vanishing. "You can't escape," the voices whispered in unison, growing louder, more insistent. And then, as if summoned by his terror, a larger figure emerged from the fog. It towered over the others, its form cloaked in tattered black robes that seemed to bleed into the ground. Its face was obscured, but the overwhelming sense of malice emanating from it was suffocating. Elliot's knees buckled. He wanted to run, to fight, to do anything, but his body betrayed him, paralyzed by fear. The figure raised a hand, long and bony, pointing directly at him. "You," it said, its voice a deep, resonant echo that shook the ground. "You will feed the darkness." The towering figure loomed closer, its presence an oppressive weight that seemed to crush the very air around Elliot. His chest tightened, and every instinct screamed at him to flee, but his legs remained frozen as if bound by invisible chains. The grotesque figures circling him began to chant, their voices a chilling symphony of malice. The words were incomprehensible, yet they clawed at his mind, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. Elliot's eyes darted around, searching for any escape, but the barren landscape stretched endlessly, the fog swallowing everything. Desperation clawed at him, and with a sudden surge of adrenaline, he forced himself to move. He ran. The ground beneath his feet felt wrong, soft and yielding, like flesh. Every step was a struggle, as if the earth itself resisted his escape. The chanting grew louder, the voices following him no matter how far he went. Ahead, a faint light pierced the fog, its warm glow a beacon of hope. Elliot sprinted toward it, his lungs burning and legs aching. The light grew brighter, illuminating a doorway standing impossibly in the middle of the void. He reached it and didn't hesitate, throwing himself through the threshold. The chanting ceased abruptly as the door slammed shut behind him. Elliot found himself in a room that was impossibly familiar, a perfect replica of his childhood home. The warm glow of a fireplace bathed the space in a comforting light, and the scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air. For a moment, he felt safe. "Elliot," a voice called, soft and melodic. He turned to see a woman sitting by the fire, her back to him. Her presence was soothing, her voice tugging at something deep within him. Who are you?" he stammered. The woman stood and turned slowly. Her face was beautiful, radiant even, but her eyes were hollow voids, endless pits of darkness. "I am what you sought," she said, her voice layered with 1,000 others. "I am what you've always feared." Elliot backed away, his heart racing. "This isn't real. None of this is real." "Oh, but it is," she replied, stepping closer. Her form began to shift, her beauty dissolving into something grotesque. Her skin sagged and twisted, her limbs elongating unnaturally. The room around them darkened, the warmth replaced by an icy chill. The walls began to bleed shadows, tendrils snaking toward him. "You came to us," the creature said, her voice now a guttural snarl. "You invited us in." The tendrils lashed out, wrapping around Elliot's arms and legs, pulling him to the ground. He struggled, screaming, but they held firm, dragging him toward the fireplace. The flames turned black, emitting no heat but an overwhelming sense of despair. "No, please," he begged, tears streaming down his face. The creature loomed over him, her hollow eyes boring into his soul. "You will feed the darkness, as all who wander here do." The tendrils pulled him into the black flames, his screams swallowed by the void. The fog lifted, and the decrepit house stood silent once more. The door creaked open, revealing a warm, inviting glow from within. A faint melody played, soft and enticing. In the distance, a figure approached, drawn by the light and the promise of safety. The house waited, patient and eternal.